Chapter 29:33. It was as if some kind of change that was beyond anyone's control had truly taken shape after Luo Fan and the incarnation of the former worlds will reached a consensus. During this change, the many space-times in the territory of the worlds will seem to have lost something that could not be described with words. At the same time, Luo Fan also felt that the many space-times in his territory seemed to have vaguely obtained something. At the same time, he could also feel that the space-times in the territory of the former worlds will seem to have also obtained something. Unfortunately, you made a wrong decision. At this moment, an inexplicable voice suddenly sounded from all directions at the same time. In the end, it converged into this sentence and entered Luo Fan's ears. This was obviously the worlds will speaking again. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly sensed something. His gaze instantly pierced through the battlefield that was countless trillions of light years away and looked towards the wider world outside the battlefield. The moment he looked over, he was shocked to see that in the vast world outside the battlefield, there were suddenly countless rays of light that appeared out of nowhere. These rays of light were so mysterious and strange. They existed between the heavens and the earth in an overwhelming manner. It seemed like everything in the world had turned into this kind of light. These rays of light were like rivers flowing into the sea. They frantically gathered towards the battlefield and continuously fused with the many spacetimes that belonged to the world's will. During this process, the spacetimes began to expand continuously, and the power in the spacetimes increased endlessly. In just a short while, the power belonging to the worlds will had skyrocketed by several times. This sudden surge caused the karma that had formed a little outline to instantly collapse again. Although it had not completely cut off the hope of successfully constructing the karma, it had already taken a huge step back. In terms of the number of victories and losses, the original outline of the karma was equivalent to the outline of the karma formed after hundreds of victories and losses. But now, it was only equivalent to the progress of constructing the karma after 1 or 2 victories and losses. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's expression instantly became extremely ugly. "You are challenging my bottom line," he said coldly. "So, has this crossed your bottom line?" The will of the heaven and earth asked calmly. Luo Fan's expression became even more unsightly. He raised his head, and his eyes seemed to penetrate the barrier of endless space-time, directly looking at the space-time where the will of heaven and earth resided. There was a huge hole there, which was still the same as before. In the hole, countless strange runes were constantly swimming and surging, filling up the hole. Around the hole, the surrounding space-time was being stimulated to shrink, carrying out various complicated confrontations with those strange runes, wanting to completely erase those runes and completely close the hole. The two of them formed an indescribable balance, causing the hole to no longer shrink or expand during this process. This appearance did not seem much different from before. However, a small that had appeared around the hole. It was a blurry, indistinct, faintly discernible, that seemed both real and illusory at the same time. This that was extremely subtle, and its size was only a few light years in radius. Compared to the hole that Luo Fan had opened up previously, it was simply insignificant. Compared to the entire space-time, it was even more insignificant. However, the area of its existence was still calculated in light years. From an absolute point of view, its size could not be considered small no matter how one looked at it. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a small matter for such a hole to suddenly appear in a space-time. Although the whole was only indistinct, and seemed both real and fake at the moment, if it was allowed to continue developing, the impact on the space-time in the end would obviously not be negligible. Unlike the huge hole, there was an extremely unique aura in the small that seemed to be both real and illusory. This aura seemed to be rather similar to the space-time aura, but it was fundamentally different from the space-time aura. The two seemed to have an extremely strong affinity, but also seemed to be incompatible. It was as if some kind of unbelievable confrontation was brewing at the border between them. With just one look, Luo Fan knew that this illusory That was actually the mark that the former incarnation of the worlds will had left on the place where the worlds will resided. As for why it would leave a mark there, the reason was very simple. It was because he had truly become a third party in this battle to construct the cause and effect. This constructed cause and effect linked the territories of the participating parties to the outcome of the battle. For Luo Fan, if he won, his territory would expand, which also meant that the areas that had broken free from the shackles of the worlds would become even larger. The areas that had broken free from the shackles of the worlds corresponded to the space-time where the worlds resided. It was the holes that had appeared out of thin air in the space-time. In other words, if the cause and effect was successfully constructed, Luo Fan's victory or defeat would be directly linked to the size of the holes. If Luo Fan's karma were to completely devour the entire world after it was formed, then this hole would probably expand to the point where it would completely fill up the entire space-time. If this was the case for Luo Fan, the other participants in the battle would naturally be the same. The world's will and the former incarnation of the world's will, which had now become a third party, would also enjoy the same treatment. At this moment, the cause and effect had not truly taken shape, and there was only a vague outline in its embryonic form. However, the effects were already there. In this part of the world, the former incarnation of the worlds had clearly occupied a part of the battlefield. Although it was not big, it was still a territory that had been recognized by Luo Fan and the world's will. In other words, if the cause and effect were to take shape now, then this part of the territory would be completely under his control and completely break free from the control of the world's will. In this way, this part of the territory would be equivalent to breaking free from the shackles of the world's will. And this breaking free from the shackles would also mean that a corresponding hole would appear in the space-time where the worlds resided. It was a tiny, faintly discernible, indistinct, illusory little hole. This was the origin of the small dot. At this moment, the small dot quickly became illusory, and in the end, only a blurry, indistinct trace was left. If Luo Fan had not noticed this place long ago, and clearly seen that the small had turned from its original appearance to its current state, he might not have discovered the existence of this trace. He might not have even discovered the existence of this trace. The reason for this change was obviously because the embryonic outline of the cause and effect, which had already taken shape, had been broken up again. Because the outline of the cause and effect had been broken up again, the small that had appeared based on the outline of the cause and effect had naturally gradually shrunk until only a trace was left. One could imagine that if this continued, when the cause and effect had completely lost all hope of taking shape, this trace would probably be completely erased. Angry from embarrassment. At this moment, a voice came from afar. As this voice spoke, an indescribable pressure appeared again. Following this pressure, the figure of a middle-aged man appeared out of thin air and appeared not far away from Luo Fan. He was also facing the surrounding void and the residents of the world's will that existed in the depths of the void. Are you planning to give up? Similar voices converged in the surroundings once again. There seemed to be a sense of anticipation and disdain in the voices. Give up? No. Now is not the time to give up, Luo Fan said calmly at this moment. As he spoke, an endless amount of energy suddenly erupted from the area that had broken free from the world's will's shackles and frantically poured into the battlefield. The space-time he had created started to grow tremendously, so the aura that the space-time emitted was not inferior to the many space-times in the territory controlled by the world's will. As he moved, the traces that belonged to the previous incarnation of the world's will on the residents of the worlds became increasingly indistinct. Previously, the traces were still relatively clear. As long as one looked closely, they could still be seen. However, now that the traces had weakened once again, they had reached the point where they could no longer be seen even if one looked closely. Only a slight sense of existence could let Luo Fan know where the traces were. Only then could he be sure that the traces still existed and had not completely disappeared. Actually, I also have a way. At this moment, the middle-aged man sneered. As he spoke, supreme energy poured into his territory out of nowhere. It fused with the many spacetimes in his territory, causing the aura of the many spacetimes to rapidly expand. In the blink of an eye, it had already reached a level comparable to the spacetime controlled by Luo Fan and the world's will. However, this change did not cause the small that above the residents of the world's will to change. The subtle trace that only left a sense of existence was still the same as before, as if nothing had happened. As expected, you've hidden your power there since a long time ago. Actually, the balance has already been broken by you. No wonder the construction of the karma is so slow. At this moment, Luo Fan sneered as he looked at the incarnation of the world's will nearby. There is only one reason why the balance did not change after the powerful energy was added, nor did it slow down the construction of the karma. It was because the energy had already been in the system since a long time ago. It had already been on the battlefield since a long time ago. This was the only way to explain it. As for why the energy had been hidden there since a long time ago, but the incarnation of the world's will did not show it, it was naturally because it had hidden it. This is my fault. However, there's no meaning in saying who's right or wrong now, right? The incarnation of the world's will smiled. His expression was incomparably firm, as if everything was under his control. This expression made people feel even more displeased. I see. No wonder I kept feeling that something was off. Back then, you really did betray me. You've been purposely putting me off all these years. The voice of the world's will rang out again. I already have my own self. Naturally, I'm completely different from before. The incarnation of the world's will said indifferently. Listening to their conversation, Luo Fan knew that what the world's will had said to him previously was not completely false. At the very least, the world will believe that what he had said was true. At the very least, he truly believed that he had been deceiving Luo Fan along with the incarnation of the world's will from the beginning. However, he did not expect that he was the only one who truly believed this from the beginning. The former incarnation of the will of the world had already obtained its freedom from the very beginning. From the very beginning, it was no longer of the same mind as him. The world's will thought that there was no secret between him and the incarnation of the world's will, but in reality, he had been kept in the dark all this time. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan had an indescribable expression on his face as he quietly watched the exchange of words between the two sides. However, the world's will did not remain angry for too long. No matter what, it was still the world's will. Its ability to control its own emotions was not something that ordinary beings could compare to. Very soon, he regained his rationality. Since things have come to this, let's change our approach. At this moment, he made an indescribable suggestion. Change our approach? Luo Fan fell into thought. That's right, another approach. If we continue like this, there will be too many variables. It's too easy to flip the table. We need to change to a more stable and less likely method. The world's will said indifferently. Hearing this, the incarnation of the world's will suddenly sneered. You're not talking about betting the entire world on this, are you? If that's the case, your advantage will be too great. Even if we work together, we probably won't be able to resist you, right? The world's will sneered. Is it my fault that you're weak and weak? Chapter 29:34. Luo Fan said indifferently, If you want it, I have no problem. He looked at the middle-aged man, who was the embodiment of the former world's will, with an indescribable expression. It wasn't that he thought the embodiment of the former world's will was childish, but he could tell that the embodiment of the former world's will seemed to want to make a bet between him and the world's will. What he said just now seemed to be refuting the world's will, but wasn't he also trying to provoke him? However, even though he understood this, Luo Fan knew that this was actually the only way, as long as he wanted to truly establish the cause and effect. After all, the world's will's previous performance had already proved how many variables would appear if the battle dragged on. Who knew when one of the parties in the battle would have the idea of flipping the table and directly take action? Once that happened, the accumulation of all the battles they had fought previously would be completely for naught, and everything would have to start from scratch. In that case, Even if they had unlimited time and wouldn't consume any of their energy due to the passage of time, they couldn't really spend all their time on such a task that was clearly far away. It wasn't just Luo Fan, the world's will was the same. As the two parties in the battle, the world's will could flip the table, and so could Luo Fan. Given the strength of the battlefield and the respective strengths of Luo Fan and the world's will couldn't stop Luo Fan from flipping the table. Luo Fan was well aware of this, and so was the world's will. In reality, it was precisely because both of them had the strength to flip the table that they could establish a tacit understanding and establish the cause and effect together. Both of them had similar strengths, and both of them believed that they had absolute confidence in the matter, so they could truly cooperate and cooperate as equals. If the world's will hadn't flipped the table before, they would naturally have believed that the other party would have some misgivings and wouldn't flip the table even if they failed. However, it was clear that the world's will had made a bad start. It had taken the initiative to flip the table, and this had swept away the tacit understanding they had established. Because of this, there was no longer any trust between them. Therefore, if they were unwilling to give up on this karmic construct, they could only use a method that neither of them could flip the table over. In other words, just like what the incarnation of the world's will had said, both sides would bet all their strength on this battle, and both sides would do their best to strengthen their side's strength in order to fight. It would be best if he could form the karma through a battle. This was not a simple matter. If they really wanted to do that, it wouldn't be something that could be achieved through the tacit understanding between them. If they really wanted to rely on a few victories in battles to truly establish the cause and effect, they would probably need to carry out a certain ceremony beforehand to complete the preliminary preparation of the cause and effect. It would be best if they could first construct the embryonic form of the cause and effect. At this moment, the will of the heaven and earth said indifferently, "Since you are willing, then come." This tribulation has lasted for far, far too long. Luo Fan frowned slightly when he heard this. This tribulation was a tribulation to him, but it was a foundation for the will of the heaven and earth. Normally, as the will of the heaven and earth, it should have been extremely concerned about the existence of this great tribulation. It should have wanted to do its best to prolong the tribulation, and it would be best if it could make it permanent. However, at this moment, he could hear the will of the heaven and earth being annoyed by the will of the heaven and earth. It was as unbelievable as a person actually being tired of living. How could he not feel that something was wrong? Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat, and he turned to look at the middle-aged man beside him. At this moment, the middle-aged man had a subtle look of helplessness on his face, as if he had seen something that made him feel powerless and pained. That kind of situation shouldn't happen, right? At this moment, Luo Fan shook his head and slightly extinguished the thought that was popping up in his heart. However, to him, it did not matter how long the tribulation would last or how long it would last. After all, to him, any place was a place for cultivation. Regardless of whether he was in the tribulation or outside of it, whether he was in the true state of chaos or the simulated state of chaos, whether he was in the big world or the perfect world, or just on the path to sainthood that was opened by a true saint, it did not make a difference to him as long as he could cultivate. At this time, although he had stayed in this great calamity for an unimaginably long time, he could still cultivate and improve. Under such circumstances, he didn't feel that there was anything wrong with continuing this great tribulation. Of course, this was only for now. With his rate of improvement, this great tribulation would eventually become useless to him one day. The environment within it would eventually become useless to him one day. When that time came, he would naturally need to escape from this tribulation and break it. It was precisely because he had anticipated that the time would come that even though he felt that it did not matter to him to be in this great calamity and that he would still be cultivating here, he was also consciously searching for a way to break through this great calamity. Even if it was not urgent, with Luo Fan's mentality, he was happy to see the world will work hard to end this tribulation. As for whether there was any secret behind this, and whether it was as unbelievable as the thought that he had just had, it did not matter. Therefore, at this moment, he directly dispelled all these thoughts. With a slight thought, He raised his hand and slapped the void. With just a single slap, countless strange lines, runes, and all sorts of strange patterns were born in the void. Under the control of his consciousness, they began to move unbelievably and inexplicably resonate with each other in the void. As they resonated, they gradually converged into one, turning into an extremely huge body that occupied an area of over 100 million light years. After this body was formed, it began to tremble slightly and began to absorb all sorts of indescribable subtle auras from all directions, causing the emptiness within the body to gradually disappear at an unbelievable speed and become filled up. At this moment, an incomparably huge vortex appeared in the void out of nowhere. The vortex exuded an extremely obvious aura that belonged to the world's will. Obviously, it was the world's will. At the very least, it was the embodiment of the world's will. After the vortex appeared in the void, it began to churn rapidly. All sorts of indescribable subtle powers were constantly generated in the churning, turning into countless indescribable pillars of power that fell from the void and fiercely smashed into the huge body below, causing the emptiness within the body that was being rapidly filled up to be filled up at an even faster speed. Under these changes, the body seemed to have turned into a living creature. It was squirming rapidly, and all the details within began to swim at an unimaginable speed. The relationships between them were changing rapidly, and there seemed to be all sorts of subtle changes appearing within the structure of the body. It even gave off a vague feeling that the body seemed to have turned into a strange world. All the runes, all the lines, and all the strange patterns seemed to have become everything in the world, and even the living creatures within it. They began to carry out all sorts of extremely complicated activities within the huge body. At this moment, the embodiment of the worlds will also made its move. In an instant, all sorts of indescribable powers were born in the void from all directions, and they began to continuously seep into the body, causing everything within the body to undergo a further evolution. The countless runes, lines, and shadows within it all became even more lively at this moment. Whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will, neither of them had any reaction to its actions, as if they had tacitly approved of its participation. Their efforts lasted for a total of 10 days and 10 nights. It must be known that back then, creating so many spacetimes was only a short period of time for them. Now, in order to construct such a body, they had worked with all their might for a total of 10 days and 10 nights. This was enough to show how extraordinary this body was. At this moment, after 10 days and 10 nights, this body had completely changed. It was now a pure and flawless body that no details could be discerned from it. This body looked like a void, like a world of its own, like a universe, like a self-sufficient existence that was completely unconnected to anything outside. At this moment, Luo Fan only indifferently said, "It's time to begin." The worlds will also said, "That's right, it's indeed time to begin." Then what are we waiting for? The middle-aged man, who is also the embodiment of the world's will, also spoke at this moment. As they spoke, countless strands of karma began to gather from all directions. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, every strand of karma was an incomparably huge river of karma. If any strand of karma entered a perfect world, it would probably be enough to distort the law of karma in that perfect world and cause chaos in the entire world. It might even trigger some sort of tribulation that affected the entire world. However, in this place, the karma that was like a river of karma in the eyes of ordinary people was only a strand of karma. At every moment, there were thousands of these strands of karma constantly fusing into that body. These were the various subtle karmic connections formed by the battle between Luo Fan, the world's will, and the embodiment of the worlds will over the past million years. These karmic connections were originally about to gather into the outline of the war karma. However, because the worlds will flip the table, they collapsed once again and scattered across the world. It was only now that the three of them worked together that they began to gather again. They were about to form their original combination in this indescribable body, once again turning into the outline of the war karma. These karmic connections were extremely heavy and difficult to deal with. If this was an ordinary space-time, a single strand of them would be enough to achieve the effect that Luo Fan and the worlds will originally wanted. In other words, to truly link the territory and the outcome of the war together. However, in this world, or rather, in such a great calamity, let alone a single strand of such karma, even if there were tens of thousands of strands, or in other words, countless rivers of karma, they would only be able to form the outline of the war karma. Even the outline of the karma could not be truly formed. From this, it could be seen how difficult it was to truly form the karma that could restrict Luo Fan and the worlds will in this world. At this moment, what Luo Fan and the others did was to rely on these karmic connections to forcefully deduce the structure of the war. They relied on this structure to actively absorb all resources to make up for the holes in these karmic connections. After that, when these holes were completely filled up, the war karma would naturally be completely formed. Of course, during this process, it was impossible for all three of them to be obedient. Each of them worked hard to leave behind a backup plan that was beneficial to them in the structure of the karma, and then worked hard to eliminate the other's backup plan. Through this method, they worked hard to make the karma lean towards them after it was formed. As for which side the karma would lean towards after it was formed, it would depend on how brilliant their methods were. All three of them were well aware of this, so they tacitly agreed to this method. Even the embodiment of the former worlds will no longer felt that this was unfair. Done. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly shouted. With this shout, an extremely powerful force erupted from the entire body. An endless suction force was born from it, acting on the void space within a range of trillions of light years. Immediately after, the suction force disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Faced with this change, the rotation of the vortex in the void seemed to change slightly, as if it was extremely restless. Chapter 29:38. At this moment, Luo Fan deeply furrowed his brows. This was a rather troublesome situation for him. Those world founders were not ordinary existences. They were existences that could create worlds in the simulated state of chaos. No matter how weak such existences were, they were definitely at the level of tribulation cultivators. Moreover, compared to those naturally born tribulation cultivators, they were much stronger in terms of understanding, support, and control of the world. With the addition of those world founders, there would definitely be an unbelievable leap in all aspects of those worlds. It could be said that with just this move, the many worlds and the territories of the world founders had completely caught up to Luo Fan and even surpassed him by a lot. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but turn his attention to the world founders under his control. Of course, he quickly dispelled this thought. Only the world's wills could use the world founders in such an important battle. Even the previous incarnations of the world's wills were inferior in comparison. For Luo Fan, it was even more impossible for him to use them. After all, the birth of the world founders was due to the need for so many world founders to simulate the primal chaos. The purpose of the simulated state of chaos was obviously to be Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. Under such circumstances, it could be said that the world founders were born with the purpose of being a part of Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. In this way, it could be said that the world founders were born with the purpose of being a part of Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. Under such circumstances, if some existences who knew the truth revealed the purpose of the world founders' birth to the world founders, the consequences would be absolutely unpredictable. There would definitely be many world founders who would choose to turn hostile and attack Luo Fan instead. Even if some of the pioneers were more rational and did not attack him, it was impossible for them to continue helping him wholeheartedly like they did in the past. In this way, sending the world creators into their own territories and letting them control those worlds was equivalent to tying a ticking time bomb to their own world. Moreover, the remote control for this time bomb was in the hands of the world founders. Under such circumstances, unless Luo Fan wanted to commit suicide There was no way he could let the world founders control the worlds and their territories. Since he could not directly let the world founders enter their own worlds to suppress them, he could only choose another method to help those worlds. After all, ignoring everything was equivalent to handing over victory with both hands. If he wanted to win, he naturally had to find a way to resolve the current disadvantage as much as possible. It was extremely difficult for the Supreme Emperors to grow into tribulation powerhouses, and without tribulation powerhouses to suppress them, it was impossible for the world to be stable. Therefore, the only way to resolve the current problem was to transmit the inheritance that the Supreme Emperors needed to break through to the worlds. At this moment, Luo Fan made up his mind. With a slight thought, his clones directly entered those worlds and began to preach the method of tribulations to the many worlds. The method of tribulation was not something that could be explained in a few words. Normally, it would take tens of millions of years of guidance for a Supreme Emperor to completely comprehend the method of tribulation. It could be said that although it was called a certain method, it was more like a form of assimilation and infection. Without the guidance of those tens of millions of years, even if he condensed all the techniques, words, and actions he had taught over the tens of millions of years and told them to the Supreme Emperor, it would still be impossible for him to make a breakthrough. Because of this, Luo Fan needed to send clones into those worlds. Fortunately, it was not difficult for him to create hundreds of millions of clones, especially when those worlds were still under his absolute control. It was even easier for him to create so many clones that were enough to completely suppress the Supreme Emperors. After those clones entered those worlds, they used various methods to summon the Supreme Emperors who might break through. After time and space transformed into a world, the supreme level of cultivators rose to the Supreme Emperor level. The False Sage stage was already considered the highest level in time and space, but there were also limited positions. However, there was no longer any limit to the number of False Sages. The cultivators who could not break through and become False Sages because they did not have a position began to become False Sages. After the world transformed into a world, the high level of cultivators rose to the level of tribulation powerhouses. At this time, similarly, the position of the Supreme Emperor, which was originally the highest level and had a limited position, was also released. The despair cultivators who could not break through because they did not have a position began to break through like a blowout. Under such circumstances, although there were still no true tribulation powerhouses in those worlds, the number of Supreme Emperors had unknowingly increased by thousands of times. Now, the number of Supreme Emperors that were summoned by Luo Fan's clone from all over the world could be considered a grand sight. Luo Fan naturally knew the situation inside these worlds. At this time, he was not surprised by the number of Supreme Emperors at all. Seeing that many Supreme Emperors who hoped to become tribulation powerhouses had appeared here, he no longer stood on ceremony. He forcibly used his supreme power to suppress those Supreme Emperors, letting them clearly feel how big the gap between them was. Just this action was enough to make them become obedient. After all the Supreme Emperors became obedient, Luo Fan's clone no longer hesitated and began to explain to them. The independence of the world was greater than that of the world, and the difference between the flow of time inside and the flow of time outside could be greater. Although the situation outside was already quite critical, and the worlds could launch a great battle at any time, there was still enough time for the Supreme Emperors to break through in those worlds. According to Luo Fan's estimation, even if the worlds launched a great battle now, when the war really reached a point where those Supreme Emperors had no choice but to give up their seclusion and start fighting, the time inside those worlds could still be extended to trillions of years. Such a time was already enough for Luo Fan to make use of to nurture a large number of tribulation powerhouses. The atmosphere in this territory that belonged to Luo Fan was quiet. Compared to the peace here, the situation in the other two worlds was obviously not so peaceful. Compared to Luo Fan's clone that directly entered those worlds to help the tribulation powerhouses that were born, The protection of the former worlds was not as convenient. It must be known that the clone of the former worlds was still hiding somewhere. He didn't dare to enter the world with his incarnation at this moment. If he dared to do that, then the will of the heavens and the earth would absolutely not hesitate to deduce the location of his true body based on his clone, and then descend upon his true body with supreme might to annihilate his true body. The clone of the former worlds was very clear about this. As for descending with his clone without affecting his true body, it was impossible for the clone of the former worlds to do that. After all, the connection between the embodiment and the original body was an extremely peculiar one. If this connection was severed, then the embodiment would become completely independent and become an independent entity. In that case, the clone would become a completely new individual and would no longer be his clone. Obviously, this went against the original purpose of the clone of the former world's will. As long as this connection was maintained, this incarnation would still be his incarnation. However, the connection between this incarnation and his original body was like an obvious guide. No matter how well hidden his original body was, existences with sharp senses could easily capture his original body through this incarnation. With this kind of restriction, it was obviously impossible for the former incarnation of the will of the world to be like Luo Fan, who directly threw his incarnation into those worlds to nurture the cultivators within them, allowing them to give birth to Tribulation Realm experts. Even though the clone of the former worlds could not use this method, it did not give up. Instead, it took another path and directly sent all kinds of inheritances into those worlds. It used mysterious techniques to communicate with the many worlds and fuse them into a single entity, instantly expanding the world in the eyes of all living beings in those worlds. Through these various actions, the supreme emperors in those worlds were stimulated countless times more than they had been the past countless years, be it in terms of their minds or power. Through this kind of stimulation, combined with the various inheritances that had been inserted into the heavens and earth, the supreme emperors had more hope of breaking through than before. This method was also a way to create tribulation powerhouses. Compared to Luo Fan directly sending his clone into those worlds to guide the supreme emperors to break through, the efficiency was much lower. However, at the very least, compared to letting the supreme emperors search for a way to break through in confusion, the efficiency was much, much higher. Perhaps in the eyes of ordinary mortals, using a mysterious technique to communicate with the many worlds would still be peaceful, and the territories would still be as stable as before. However, anyone with the slightest perception would know that at this moment, the territories of the former worlds were in a state of turmoil. The conflict between the circulation of auras, the conflict between the wills of living beings, and the conflict between the foundations of the world had caused an earth-shattering commotion beyond the line of sight of the mortals. It caused the territory to be like a barrel filled with gunpowder, giving off the illusion that it would explode in the next moment. In order to give birth to tribulation powerhouses, the territories of the former worlds were no longer peaceful. However, in the territories of the former worlds those worlds were not peaceful at all. Those worlds were nurtured bit by the worlds from time and space. Although they were already worlds, it was obvious that they did not have many special characteristics. If the tribulation powerhouses in those worlds were born naturally, they would naturally be very compatible with the world, and the current situation of those worlds would naturally make the tribulation powerhouses extremely satisfied. However, it was clear that the experts who had entered the tribulation in those worlds were not naturally born from those worlds. Those tribulation powerhouses were formed by the world's will, which was directly sent into those worlds by the world's will. Under such circumstances, the worlds that did not have many special characteristics were obviously very uncomfortable for the world's founders, and they were very dissatisfied with everything. Evidently, these world creators did not enter those worlds to be hired thugs of those worlds. The reason they entered those worlds was to become the controllers, guides, and suppressors of the world. Since that was the case, the world was not compatible with them, so they naturally could not adapt to the world. Instead, the world had to adapt to them. Therefore, after discovering that there were too many things that were not to their liking in the worlds that they had entered, the world's founders chose to directly transform those worlds. They transformed the laws, structures, energy, matter, and even the frequency of time and space that were not compatible with them. Under such transformation, those worlds naturally could not be as peaceful as before. Almost all the worlds were undergoing this transformation, producing all sorts of inexplicable changes. It was as if some kind of plasticine was being casually kneaded by an invisible hand. Occasionally, some kind of huge explosion would appear in those worlds, causing them to undergo some sort of big or small change in those worlds. With so many worlds undergoing such changes, how could the territory that belonged to the worlds will still be peaceful? At this time, the territories of the three parties were extremely strange. They still maintained their original state of non-interference. This gave Luo Fan more time to nurture the many cultivators in his territory, so that they would have a greater chance of becoming tribulation powerhouses before the real battle broke out. Under this state of non-interference between the three parties, time gradually passed. Unknowingly, 100 years had passed. Chapter 29:39. The billions of trillion years were a long period of time for the living beings in the world, but for Luo Fan, the world's will, and the former incarnation of the world's will, it was only a slightly longer period of time. Even if they devoted themselves to these worlds, they wouldn't leave any traces of time because of the passage of billions of trillions of years. What's more, during this period of time, only Luo Fan's incarnation had entered the world. His real body was still outside the world, so he was naturally less affected. The impact of this long period of time on the worlds was also quite obvious. In the territory of the world will, such a long period of time had already caused the world to completely change. Under the modification of the many world founders, the world had already completely adapted to them. Now, there didn't seem to be many traces left in the world when it was first formed. Looking at it now, those worlds looked more like the worlds created by the creators of the world. It was so much so that one could even find traces of the worldview that belonged to the world founders, and these traces had even changed the nature of the world. As for the power of the world, it was constantly rising during this process. Now, apart from the world founders, the number of tribulation stage powerhouses in the world was already full. In other words, the number of tribulation stage powerhouses in the world was the same as the number of tribulation stage powerhouses that the world could withstand. These tribulation stage powerhouses occupied their respective positions, using their own power to suppress and nourish the world. Because all the tribulation stage powerhouses had returned to their positions, the world was many times more stable than before. Moreover, because the nature of the world had been changed, these tribulation stage powerhouses' worldview had unknowingly been distorted over the long period of time. Now, they had already completely complied with the worldview of the world founders and recognized that worldview as the true worldview in the depths of their hearts. Under such a change, their ego had already unknowingly become distorted in a subtle way. However, it was clear that this distortion was only meaningful to them. For everything in the outside world, this distortion was meaningless, perhaps to them. The distorted selves were no longer the original selves. This kind of distortion was equivalent to killing the original self. It could be said to be a kind of irreconcilable hatred. However, to the outside world, what was the difference between the tribulation realm expert before the distortion and the one after the distortion? For the outside world, as long as it was a tribulation realm expert, it was enough. As for whether that self was the original self or the new self, it didn't matter at all. After all the tribulation cultivators in the world returned to their positions, the instability of the foundation of the world had completely disappeared, and the world's ability to withstand cultivators had greatly increased. Due to this, the rate at which the cultivators of the world grew increasingly faster. Originally, the world could withstand an unlimited number of supreme emperors, despaired ones, and false saints. However, because not all the tribulation experts had returned, it was difficult for the world's potential to be fully unleashed. If a cultivator wanted to cultivate to a higher realm, although there were no shackles that made people despair, the world would still not be able to support them. In this way, cultivators would not be able to obtain much help from the world when cultivating, and their cultivation speed would naturally not be very fast. However, now that the situation had changed, the world's attitude towards the growth of cultivators was completely different. That kind of strong support was enough to weaken the bottleneck of a cultivator's breakthrough, and it was enough to reduce the difficulty of a cultivator's improvement. In this way, the number of cultivators could naturally be expected to increase. At this moment, in terms of the quality of cultivators, the world was at least tens of thousands of times stronger than before. Not to mention, in terms of quantity, the world's will was far superior to before. It could be said that in just a short 100 years in the outside world, the power within the territory of the world's will had increased by hundreds of thousands of times. If the world's will's territory was like this, the situation in the former world's will's territory was not much different. Although it didn't directly send the creator of the world into the world, it could easily make tribulation cultivators appear in the world's territories. However, the incarnation of the former world's will had sent its inheritance into the world, expanding the horizons of all living beings in the world, and increasing the communication between them was also very effective. After so many years of development, the tribulation cultivators in the world had also been born. Although the quality of the tribulation cultivators was much lower than the creator of the world, they were born from the clashes between many supreme emperors. Therefore, the number of cultivators that had a chance of breaking through and becoming tribulation cultivators was many times higher than the number of cultivators in the world's will's territory. It could be said that if it wasn't for the world's restriction on the number of tribulation cultivators, the number of tribulation cultivators in the world would have definitely increased by several times. However, even so, the cultivators that had a chance of breaking through and becoming tribulation cultivators were far stronger than ordinary supreme emperors. If a peak monarch realm existence were to encounter such an expert, then that peak monarch realm existence would probably not be able to withstand a single strike or even a single gaze from him. It could be said that such existences could be called half-step tribulation cultivators. In the eyes of supreme emperors, these half-step tribulation cultivators were no different from true tribulation cultivators. In the eyes of true tribulation cultivators, they were no different from supreme emperors. This situation could be said to be quite awkward. However, this awkward situation made them unimaginably useful in the war. As long as they avoided the tribulation cultivators, they were almost invincible. In this case, as long as there were tribulation cultivators holding back the creator of the world's will's territory, the other battlefields would no longer pose any threat to them. It could be said that success and victory were only a matter of time. This situation made the territory of the former worlds will not be at an absolute disadvantage against the territory of the world's will. In the comparison of supreme cultivators, the territory of the former worlds was at a disadvantage. However, in the case of other forces, the territory of the former worlds was at an absolute advantage. In this way, although the advantages and disadvantages could not be directly neutralized, they would still affect each other in the end. In the end, the two sides were barely on par. Unlike the development of the other two sides in Luo Fan's territory, there were his incarnations guiding all living beings in the world. The speed at which the cultivators inside improved was much faster than the speed at which the cultivators inside the avatar of the will of the world improved. At the same time, in the territory of the former world's will, there were only newly born tribulation cultivators. On the other hand, in Luo Fan's territory, many of the supreme emperors had not only become tribulation realm powerhouses, but they had also taken a big step forward in the tribulation realm. Currently, in the many worlds in Luo Fan's territory, the number of tribulation cultivators had reached the limit that the world could bear. Moreover, the level of these tribulation cultivators was not low. Most of them had surpassed the second tribulation, and some had even surpassed the third or fourth tribulation. Such strength was not much weaker than even those who had opened up the world. It must be said that although the world's creators were famous and had terrifying titles, they were still cultivators created by Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. No matter what, it was impossible for his cultivation to surpass Luo Fan's. In other words, it was impossible for them to surpass the seventh tribulation cultivator level. As a result, most of the world's creators' cultivation realms were only at the third or fourth tribulation level. The fifth tribulation could already be considered to surpass most people. The sixth tribulation could already be considered a peak expert. As for the seventh tribulation, it was the peak above the peak, and they were strong competitors for the perfect world's creators. Under such circumstances, the world's creators that were sent into the many worlds in the territory of the former worlds will only had an average cultivation realm of the fourth or fifth tribulation. Compared to Luo Fan's territory, where the average level of tribulation cultivators was at the second or third tribulation, they were indeed much stronger. However, compared to the average level of tribulation cultivators at the first or second tribulation in the territory of the former world's will, they were much stronger. Moreover, because of the guidance of Luo Fan's speech, the overall strength of the cultivators in his territory could be said to have improved. However, it was not just a few supreme emperors that broke through and became tribulation cultivators. Instead, there were too many supreme emperors that really came into contact with the threshold of tribulation. If it were not for the fact that the world's tolerance for tribulation cultivators was limited, and the number of tribulation cultivators that could be born in the world was limited, perhaps the number of tribulation cultivators in each world would have multiplied by several times. After all, the strongest tribulation cultivators could make great strides in the tribulation realm with Luo Fan's guidance. Even if the other cultivators who received guidance from Luo Fan gained less, they would still have gained something. These supreme emperors that could not become tribulation cultivators due to the restrictions of the world could also be called half-step tribulation cultivators. Such a powerhouse was an invincible existence in the eyes of the supreme emperors. However, to the real tribulation cultivators, they were absolute weaklings. In this way, their existence also made the power below the tribulation cultivator level in Luo Fan's territory far superior to that of the former world's will. The situation in Luo Fan's territory was similar to the situation in the former world's will's territory. However, the power in Luo Fan's territory was superior to that of the former world's will's territory in all aspects. It could be said that if the will of the heavens and earth did not participate or pay attention to it, just the power in Luo Fan's own territory would be enough to completely annihilate the territory of the former will of the heavens and earth, completely eliminating the incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth. Of course, Luo Fan obviously would not make such a choice. If he took the initiative to eliminate the former world's will's incarnation, he would lose a lot of power in the process. If he did that, he would have to face the world's will's territory alone. Obviously, even the low-level power could easily suppress the low-level power in the world's will's territory. However, in terms of the high-level power, his territory was still at a disadvantage. If they really fought like that, although there was some suspense about the outcome, it was still more likely that he would lose. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan chose to attack the former world's will's incarnation first, he would obviously be courting death. In comparison, if he cooperated with the former world's will's incarnation, the situation would be completely different. Although the high-level power in the world's will's territory would be stronger than any of the high-level power in Luo Fan's territory and the former world's will's territory alone. However, if Luo Fan and the former world's will's territory truly joined forces, they would definitely be on par in terms of high-level power. Once this happened, it would be enough for Luo Fan and the former world's will's territory to achieve complete victory. After all, if the high-level power was in a stalemate, the low-level power would have an absolute advantage. In that case, as long as the high-level power held the opponent back, the low-level power would quickly eliminate the opponent's low-level power, and then converge with the high-level power to attack the opponent's high-level power. Victory would be certain. Even if they had to pay a huge price, In other words, if Luo Fan and the former world's will's incarnation worked together, then both sides would definitely win. However, it was clear that it was impossible for them to cooperate with each other. After all, Luo Fan's territory was superior to the former world's will's territory in all aspects. If the world's will did not act as a third party to restrain Luo Fan, the former world's will would not be able to stop Luo Fan's territory at all. Therefore, the former worlds will definitely not allow such a situation to happen. If it cooperated with Luo Fan to eliminate the world's will, wouldn't it create such a situation? Chapter 2940. Therefore, the upcoming war would obviously be an extremely complicated three-way war. Alliance, unity, resistance, and betrayal would be the mainstream of the upcoming war. If they were to carry out this decisive battle to obtain the final victory, then it could be predicted that this battle would continue into the distant future. However, it was obvious that the reason why Luo Fan and the other two parties wanted to carry out the decisive battle was because they wanted to obtain the final victory and defeat the other two parties. However, that was only the best and smoothest situation. In their hearts, they clearly knew that if they wanted to obtain the final victory and completely suppress the other two parties, the difficulty was actually unimaginable. It was precisely because of this that although they were wholeheartedly working hard to obtain the final victory, they clearly knew that the real reason they were carrying out this decisive battle was to completely form the war cause and effect. Obviously, the war cause and effect needed to form, but what it needed was not to truly determine the victor. At least, after Luo Fan, the world's will, and the incarnation of the former worlds will cooperated and reconstructed it, it was no longer necessary to determine the victor of the war. Now, for the war cause and effect to form, what it needed was only the subtle existence related to the war cause and effect that leaked out during the course of the war. Therefore, for this decisive battle, their goal was to be able to last until the war cause and effect were completely formed. It would naturally be best if they could obtain victory during this period, but even if they could not obtain victory, it did not matter much. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was not too anxious. Even though he knew that the outcome of this decisive battle between the three parties would not be so easy to determine. It was only to continuously guide the cultivators in their territories to continue to grow. Peace on the eve of such a decisive battle was extremely precious. The fact that it was so precious meant that it was extremely rare. Even for the three parties, if they continued to wait, they would be able to allow the worlds and their territories to grow continuously. However, there would ultimately be differences in the speed of growth. Those that grew slowly would naturally hope to disrupt the faster growth of their enemies. Among them, it could be said that the one that grew the slowest was the territory of the former world's will. At least, this was the case for the higher-ups and powerhouses who had entered the tribulation realm. After all, in the territory of the former world's will, there were no avatars of the former world's will to guide the living beings, nor were there any readily available creators of the world for it to enjoy the fruits of its labor. Therefore, on a day several years later, the incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth finally confirmed that if he continued to wait, he would unknowingly be left behind by Luo Fan and the will of the heavens and earth. In the end, he sighed and took the initiative to start the final battle. Its target was none other than the territory of the will of the heavens and earth. The territory of the will of heaven and earth was still the strongest at this moment. Under such circumstances, it was naturally a natural target. The first target of attack was naturally him. If he wanted to obtain the final victory, as the army moved out, smoke and dust surged in the surroundings. Power surged, and the waves below seemed to have become violent, creating world-shaking turbulence. As the vanguard, it was naturally the low-level cultivators. In any war, the true high-level experts would not be dispatched so easily. After all, no matter how much information he obtained before he came into contact with them, it couldn't compare to actual contact. And the high-level experts obviously cared a lot about their own lives. Facing the enemy directly without obtaining accurate information was simply irresponsible for one's own life. Therefore, it was necessary for the low-level experts to test the waters in the early stages. The low-level experts were obviously stronger in the territory of the former world's will. Therefore, the first wave of the war ended with the former world's will's victory. Of course, it was only a probing attack after all. Even if they won, they wouldn't gain much from it. This also meant that the territory of the former worlds did not suffer much loss because of this. In fact, not a single one of the heavens and earth was destroyed. The result of this test increased the former world's will's confidence. For a moment, he was more confident that he could obtain more victories. However, this situation was obviously only temporary. In terms of overall strength, the territory of the former world's will was stronger. Soon, the world's will's counterattack arrived. This counterattack was so fierce that it caused the former world's will's incarnation to suffer huge losses. Even the Tribulation Realm powerhouses had no choice but to block it. And when the Tribulation Realm powerhouses attacked, it instantly attracted the world creators in the territory of the world's will. The creators of this world had lived in this world for billions of trillions of years. It was so much so that the heavens and earth had been adjusted to a form that was compatible with them at their will. How could they not have feelings for the world? Even without the existence of the world's will's command, they would definitely teach the enemies who attacked the world they were in a lesson, not to mention the existence of the world's will's command. Therefore, soon, the battle between the Tribulation Realm powerhouses broke out. Tribulation Realm powerhouses, even those who had just entered the tribulation, were far stronger than the powerhouses below the Tribulation Realm by countless times. When such existences fought, the world instantly became extremely fragile. There were traces of cracks everywhere, and there were chaotic scenes of laws and laws everywhere. There were also all kinds of indescribable scenes of destruction appearing out of thin air. The commotion caused by their battles was even greater than the commotion caused by the battles of billions of living beings in the lower levels. The destruction caused was not something that the battles of billions of living beings in the lower levels could compare to. As soon as this kind of battle appeared, it spread at an unimaginable speed. Soon, more and more Tribulation Realm powerhouses joined the battle. The battle escalated as a result. After all, the strength of the world creators was much higher than the Tribulation Realm powerhouses in the territory of the former world's will's incarnation. In this kind of battle, they naturally won again and again. Very soon, they had already forced the ascended tribulation experts in the territory formed by the will of the world to retreat, and before they knew it, they had already retreated from the battlefield. Under such circumstances, if they continued to move forward, they would soon approach the territory of the former world's will's incarnation. This was the case in the battlefield of the higher levels. Although the situation on the battlefield of the lower levels was completely different at the beginning, as time passed, the impact of the defeat of the higher levels gradually spread to the lower levels. Gradually, the situation on the lower levels began to reverse. Since the situation on the lower levels was the same, the incarnation of the former worlds could only begin to ask for help. Luo Fan had already seen the situation of the battle. When he received the request for help, he could only sigh and send his own high-level combat power, which was the Tribulation Realm powerhouses, to participate in the battle. The battle speed of the Tribulation Realm powerhouses was extremely fast, and they could exchange hundreds of millions of attacks in an instant. Under such circumstances, the Tribulation Realm powerhouses in the territory of the former world's will's incarnation began to die in the time that Luo Fan sent them to their destination. Why are you so slow? The incarnation of the former worlds was furious. It must be known that the cultivation of a Tribulation Realm powerhouse was extremely difficult. It could be said that the death of any Tribulation Realm powerhouse meant that their countless years of hard work had gone up in smoke. Under such circumstances, watching a Tribulation Realm powerhouse completely die in their hands was definitely not a good feeling. Even if it was the incarnation of the former world's will, it would not be any different. Luo Fan said indifferently, "It's already very fast. Who knew that you couldn't even hold on for such a short period of time?" As he spoke, his Tribulation Realm powerhouses had already smashed into the battlefield, and together with the incarnation of the former world's will, they fought against the Tribulation Realm powerhouses in the territory of the former world's will. In other words, the world's creator. The Tribulation Realm powerhouses that Luo Fan sent out were all relatively powerful. In other words, they had already reached a certain distance in the Tribulation Realm. Although not all of them had reached the level of the world's creator, at least some of them were already comparable to the world's creator. With their participation, the situation of the high-level battlefield gradually began to change. Although it was not enough to turn the tables immediately and turn the Tribulation Realm powerhouses into the former world's will, at least they had stopped their retreat. Barely, they had reached a balance. This balance of power finally stopped the gradual retreat of the former incarnation of the will of the world in the lower levels of the battlefield. The situation gradually began to shift in favor of the incarnation of the former world's will. Of course, the incarnation of the former world's will was not very happy about this. After all, he had killed many Tribulation Realm powerhouses. Even if these Tribulation Realm powerhouses could be quickly replenished, in the world where the dead Tribulation Realm powerhouses were born, their deaths finally freed up the space they occupied. For those powerhouses who were stuck in the half-step Tribulation Realm, because they had no space, the vacated space was space for them to advance. In this way, in those worlds, when a Tribulation Realm powerhouse died, a new Tribulation Realm powerhouse would naturally be born to replenish the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses. However, being able to replenish the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses was one thing, but this kind of replenishment consumed the foundation of those worlds. At this time, it could be replenished because the foundation was still sufficient. When more Tribulation Realm powerhouses died and the foundation was exhausted, it would not be so easy to replenish the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses. At that time, the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses that died would be the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses that were lost, and their own strength would be weakened. In the face of such a loss, it was understandable that the incarnation of the former worlds would be anxious. Compared to before, it seems to be more emotional. Although Luo Fan did not express it on his face, he was secretly weighing the incarnation of the former worlds will in his heart. At this time, he felt that the incarnation of the former worlds will seem to be more emotional than before. In other words, it was more like a living being. After all, if it was the incarnation of the former world's will, let alone the death of a Tribulation Realm powerhouse, even if all the worlds in its territory were destroyed, it would not cause too much of an emotional fluctuation. This situation made him more certain of the possibility that he had thought of before. However, this was not the time to consider this. Although he did not directly participate in the war below, he was constantly paying attention to the situation of the war. He was even more concerned about the former world's will and the incarnation of the former world's will. Whether it was the situation of the war or the other two sides, they were obviously crucial to his goal. There was no need to say much about the situation of the war. If he was not careful, the incarnation of the former world's will and the former world's will might reverse their positions and become friends, working together to trap him. There was no need to mention the original body of the former world's will and the incarnation of the former world's will. Although they did not do anything at this time, they could appear at any time. At some point, if one of them felt that the situation could not be salvaged, they would disregard their pride and personally attack the other two sides' territories. If that really happened, he would naturally have to personally stop it. After all, if he did not act in time, all the forces he sent out in his territory might be completely wiped out by one of them with a flash of his eyes. With their strength, it was a piece of cake for them to do this. In order to avoid such an outcome, he had to pay attention to the two of them at all times and be on guard against them at all times. Of course, whether it was the former world's will or the incarnation of the former world's will, they were also paying attention to the battlefield in him. What he was worried about was also what the other two sides were worried about. If the other two sides could do it, Luo Fan could definitely do it easily too. Under such circumstances, the three sides were paying attention to each other at the same time and were on guard against each other at the same time. They were all holding each other back and did not directly attack each other because of all kinds of restraints. The war continued, and the forces of the former worlds will and the incarnation of the former worlds will begin to weaken continuously. Suddenly, one day, Luo Fan suddenly realized that the scale of the war on that battlefield seemed to be gradually shrinking, and the forces of both sides seemed to be gradually holding back. Chapter 29:41. As he sighed, Luo Fan ordered the low-level cultivators in his territory to open up their territories and attack the territory of the world's will. At this moment, the world's will was at a disadvantage. With so many low-level cultivators participating in the attack, the world's will was on the verge of defeat. Fortunately, the world's will was not completely at ease with Luo Fan. While it was fighting against the territory of the former world's will, it still placed a small portion of its power at the border of Luo Fan's territory to guard against Luo Fan's possible attack at any time. Under such circumstances, and in the face of such an attack, although the will of the world felt extremely hasty and felt that it was on the verge of defeat, in the end, it still didn't allow the low-level cultivators in Luo Fan's territory to truly attack any part of its territory. It won't be that easy. A calm voice came from the void. Soon after, countless runes suddenly appeared among the millions of worlds and surrounded them. Moreover, the runes faintly resonated with each other. As they resonated with each other, they transmitted the power of the world to each other. Soon, it connected all the heavens and earth into one, forming a long chain that looked like a huge array formation. Unbelievable power was continuously released from the worlds. With the worlds as the source of power, it began to indiscriminately destroy everything within its range. Whether it was the cultivators on Luo Fan's side or the cultivators on the world's will's side. In this kind of destruction, it was unknown how many Supreme Emperors on Luo Fan's side were completely wiped out. The number of cultivators who were weaker than Supreme Emperors was tens of thousands of times greater than this number. The losses were so great that even Luo Fan could not help but feel heartache. Of course, in contrast, although the losses on Luo Fan's side were huge, the world's will's losses were not much lesser. In fact, to a certain extent, the losses on its side were many times greater than those on Luo Fan's side. First, there were the losses of living beings. In order to guard against an attack from Luo Fan's side, the will of heaven and earth had only left a small portion of its power here, but it was definitely not a small amount. It would only make sense if their numbers were on the same order of magnitude as Luo Fan's side. Therefore, in terms of the number of living creatures, cultivators, and various cultivation realms, the losses on his side were on the same order of magnitude as the losses on Luo Fan's side. In other words, the losses of the Supreme Emperors were also calculated in the tens of thousands, and the losses of the cultivators below them were also on a similar scale. This kind of loss could already be said to be extremely considerable. More importantly, the activation of such a formation would obviously cause great damage to those worlds. At this moment, after unleashing such a terrifying attack, the various runes that covered the heavens and earth had already become tattered, as if they had already become scattered and could no longer be retrieved. Following this change, countless cracks and holes began to appear in the world itself. It felt like a glass ball that had already been shattered had been glued back together. Such a loss could almost be said to have beaten all the growth that these worlds had experienced in the past billions of years back to their original state. It could be said that the state of these worlds had returned to the state they were in billions of years ago with just this activation of the formation. Such a world even affected the endurance of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses. Some of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses who were fighting with Luo Fan's side and the former will of heaven and earth on another battlefield suddenly felt an indescribable pressure on their bodies. The support of the world that was originally as natural as breathing had suddenly been completely cut off. This change greatly affected the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses. Although none of them were knocked back to the Supreme Emperor realm because of this, they were still much weaker than before. However, in all aspects, he was much, much weaker than before. It went without saying how much of an impact this sudden weakening would have on a battle that was originally in a stalemate. In just an instant, at least half of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses were directly smashed by their opponents and almost completely wiped out. There's something wrong with the world. The lucky survivors of the world made this judgment in shock. They were in a sorry state. They became Ascension Tribulation powerhouses in the world that they were born in. However, without the support of the world, without the world opening up a place for them, it was impossible for them to become Ascension Tribulation powerhouses. Although they would be true Ascension Tribulation powerhouses, after becoming Ascension Tribulation powerhouses, they would not fall back to their original state just because the world had a problem and took back their original position. However, this kind of support was still crucial to them. It was like a person who climbed up to the roof with the help of a ladder. Was the ladder really useless to him? That was obviously impossible. If you climbed up to the roof, you would have to come down, right? How could you jump down without a ladder? Furthermore, this roof wasn't just a single layer. There was an even higher roof above it. If you didn't have a ladder, how could you go up to the higher roof? For the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses, the support of the world was the ladder. For the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses, without the support of the world, they would lose their way of retreat, their foundation, and the way to go further. It could be said that the world was their root. Its importance did not need to be explained. All the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses understood this very well. Otherwise, they would not have sacrificed so much to protect their own world. Even the will of the world could not have absolute control over the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses. Perhaps the will of the world in a chaotic state had this ability, but the level of the will of the world in a simulated chaotic state determined that it could not completely control the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses. If the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses did not take the initiative, the strength they could exert would not be so strong. Now, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses felt the changes in their bodies. They instantly understood that there was a problem with the world that they were born in. For a moment, they were extremely anxious, and they no longer had much interest in the battle that was going on here. All of them wanted to immediately return to their own world to see what was wrong with it and how they could eliminate it. Under this change, the performance of the will of the world became even worse. Although they were at a disadvantage, they could still barely hold on. But as the thoughts of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses changed, this barely holding situation began to collapse quickly. The high-level forces on the side of the will of the world began to gradually withdraw their strength, changing from the original offensive to defensive. Some of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses even directly left the battlefield after thinking about it, heading towards the direction of their own world. At this time, Luo Fan was extremely displeased with the decisiveness of the will of the world. Although his side was the strongest among the three sides, even so the loss just now still made him feel extremely pained. At this time, he clearly saw the damage that the many worlds on the side of the will of the world suffered after releasing such a powerful attack in the form of formation. He made a prompt decision and instantly issued orders. Under his orders, a large number of cultivators began to open up their own territories and attack the territory of the will of the world. This time, the number of cultivators he mobilized was several times more than the previous wave. Moreover, among them, there were a large number of Ascension Tribulation powerhouses mixed in. The Ascension Tribulation powerhouses that were sent to support the former incarnation of the will of the world naturally could not be all of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses that Luo Fan had. Since he knew that he had to guard against the incarnation of the former will of the world turning hostile, he naturally could not wholeheartedly help the incarnation of the former will of the world. Of course, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses that were sent to support the incarnation could not be all of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouses that he had. In this way, at this time, he could naturally send some Ascension Tribulation powerhouses to participate in this side of the battlefield. The speed of the cultivator army was extremely astonishing. Although it was much slower than the speed of a true Ascension Tribulation powerhouse, it was still not something that an ordinary army could compare to. Even if an ordinary army had all kinds of transportation, it would take them a few days to travel tens of thousands of miles. Currently, The width of the battlefield between Luo Fan and the worlds was calculated in light years. If it was an ordinary army, it would probably take them tens of millions of years to arrive. However, for the cultivator army, it was only a few days before the army completely entered the territory of the world's will and began to attack it. After the war began, the independence of the worlds and the various territories was broken. The flow of time within them was naturally the same as the flow of time in the outside world. Therefore, a few days was only a few days to those worlds, and it did not increase much because of the difference in the flow of time between the outside world and the outside world. A few days was a negligible amount of time when compared to the scale of the damage done to the world. Therefore, even with a few days as a buffer, the situation of the worlds was still extremely bad, and they did not recover much at all. How dilapidated and damaged it was back then was how dilapidated and damaged it was now. Under such circumstances, one could imagine the performance of the worlds in the face of the attack of Luo Fan's army. Even with all sorts of support from the other heavens and earth, even if those heavens and earth forced out their potential as much as possible, in the end, those heavens and earth still fell one after another. After occupying those worlds, Luo Fan did not hesitate to use his own power. With the help of the embryonic form of war's karma, he began to distort those worlds, change them, and seize the supreme authority of those worlds. All of you deserve to die. Outside a certain world, a Ascension Tribulation powerhouse let out a shrill roar. This was Ascension Tribulation powerhouse who had returned to see that his world had fallen. The battlefield between the incarnation of the world's will and the world's was extremely far away from the battlefield between Luo Fan and the world's will. At the very least, it was several tens of thousands of times further than the border between Luo Fan and the former incarnation of the world's will. Because of this, the speed of the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse was much faster than the speed of the army. However, by the time he rushed back, the world he was born in had completely fallen. At this moment, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse's heart was filled with grief and indignation. He felt like a warrior who risked his life to fight outside, only to find that his wife and child had been killed by his neighbor when he returned home. At this moment, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse felt a ruthlessness that could destroy the world, and he wanted to destroy everything in the world. However, at this moment, before he could decide what to do, he realized that a huge number of cultivators suddenly charged at him, and a destructive aura pressed down on him. The terrifying aura even made it difficult for him to breathe. There are Ascension Tribulation powerhouses. At this moment, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse realized that there was a powerhouse on par with him in the army. Only the existence of such a powerhouse could give him such a terrifying pressure and make him feel fear from the bottom of his heart. Although his heart was filled with grief and indignation, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse still had the desire to live. At this moment, he had no intention of fighting with his life on the line. Instead, he turned around and left in an attempt to escape from this troublesome place. Unfortunately, it was easy for him to come, but it was not so easy for him to leave. Luo Fan's army was too experienced in dealing with such powerhouses, so they had already set up a formation to seal off the area. Seeing that the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse was about to escape, the formation was instantly activated and completely sealed off the space around him. As the space was sealed, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse's plan to escape quickly became an extravagant hope. Of course, he could still use flying techniques to escape, but the speed of flying techniques was obviously not as fast as traveling through the void. In fact, many flying techniques even required the principle of traveling through the void. In this way, the possibility of him successfully escaping was greatly reduced. Soon, the Ascension Tribulation powerhouse was surrounded by the army and was in a desperate situation. Powerful cultivators were all around him. Chapter 2942. The situation seemed to be extremely disadvantageous to the world's will. Luo Fan's forces continued to advance, conquering more and more lands that belonged to the world's will and turning them into a part of his territory. More and more Tribulation Realm experts were killed in the process because they were surrounded just like the first Tribulation Realm expert who was surrounded. The outcome of the battle seemed to be gradually becoming clear. However, Luo Fan did not look too happy in the face of such a situation. To him, all of this was only temporary. Things would definitely change in the future. This was a judgment formed from his understanding of the world's will and the former incarnation of the world's will. This judgment was definitely not without reason. Very soon, reality proved that his judgment was correct. This was because, as expected, the former incarnation of the world's will would turn hostile very soon. For the former incarnation of the world's will, maintaining a balance between the three sides could be said to be his only hope of reaping the fruits of victory. The other two sides, whether it was Luo Fan's side or the former incarnation of the world's will, were far more powerful than his side. Under such circumstances, even if the two sides were to fight to the bitter end, the remaining strength would still be a huge pressure for him. If the other two sides did not completely suffer, and one side gained a slight advantage and won, he would almost have no ability to resist at all. Under such circumstances, it was clear that whether it was Luo Fan's side or the former incarnation of the world's will who won, it would not be in the interests of the former incarnation of the world's will. Therefore, it could be said that his position was naturally different from that of Luo Fan and the former incarnation of the world's will. For Luo Fan and the former incarnation of the world's will, obtaining the final victory was the deepest desire in their hearts. Although they knew that the chances of a final victory were not very high, all of their actions and efforts were for the sake of obtaining the final victory. The difference in their positions made it impossible for Luo Fan and the former incarnation of the world's will to truly believe in it. Therefore, whether it was Luo Fan or the former incarnation of the world's will, they were already mentally prepared for its betrayal and fallout. It was even to the extent that they could roughly predict when he would turn hostile and betray them. Under such circumstances, the betrayal of the former incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth only achieved mediocre results. In that three-way battlefield, when the Tribulation Realm powerhouses under the former incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth switched sides and cooperated with the Tribulation Realm powerhouses under the will of the heavens and earth to attack the Tribulation Realm powerhouses under Luo Fan. The besieged Tribulation Realm powerhouses were only slightly stunned before they immediately reacted and took the most perfect response. Although they suffered some injuries, none of them died because of the sudden betrayal. As expected, I was still doubtful of Teacher's warning. Now, it seems that Teacher is indeed Teacher. His foresight is far beyond our imagination. One of the Tribulation Realm experts sneered and said to those who were originally his companions, but were now launching attacks at him with no regard for anything else. The teacher he was talking about was naturally the incarnation of Luo Fan in those worlds, as the guide for the growth of all cultivators in this world, as well as the existence that helped these Tribulation Realm experts to successfully break through. Luo Fan's incarnation was their teacher to all living beings in those worlds. This was especially true for these Tribulation Realm experts. There's nothing I can do. This is destined by the heavenly Tao. The Tribulation Realm expert who betrayed and attacked had a guilty look on his face. Although he said so, his actions did not slow down in the slightest, as if he was treating his companion who was just a few breaths ago as an irreconcilable enemy. Such scenes were happening in almost every corner of the three battlefields. Although the Tribulation Realm experts under Luo Fan were quite skilled, they could not compare to his opponents in terms of numbers. Moreover, his own cultivation realm was not comparable to the strongest of his opponents. Therefore, the situation was gradually falling in the direction of his side's complete collapse. Looks like it's time to activate the final plan. One of the Tribulation Realm experts looked around and made a judgment in his heart. At the same time, an inexplicable spiritual connection was generated from the many Tribulation Realm experts and directly transmitted to him, allowing him to instantly understand that the other Tribulation Realm experts had also made a similar judgment. As a result, they instantly activated some kind of formation node that they had prepared long before participating in this battle. As the node was activated, the mini-tribulation realm experts turned into a huge formation node at the same time. Their power instantly erupted at this moment and was transmitted to the other nodes through some mysterious and wondrous channel. In a blink of an eye, tens of thousands of tribulation realm powerhouses on Luo Fan's side, who were spread out over an area spanning hundreds of millions of light years, instantly formed a whole. The power of this whole body communicated with each other, and there were faint signs of their souls fusing together. It looked like they had turned into an incomparably great individual formed by countless tribulation realm experts. In that instant, boundless power flowed in the void, and the entire battlefield that spanned hundreds of millions of light years seemed to have fallen into a mysterious domain. It was as if everything was under the control of some indescribable existence. In that instant, the other tribulation realm experts who did not belong to Luo Fan's side all felt an unimaginable pressure weighing down on them. That pressure was so terrifying and mysterious. After it appeared, it directly suppressed everything in their bodies, causing them to faintly feel that everything in their bodies was greatly affected. Everything seemed to be unable to display the same effects as before. At this moment, the world's will and the previous incarnation of the worlds will felt that something was wrong at the same time. They all shifted their attention to this battlefield. Compared to the tribulation realm experts who were in a daze and had no idea what was going on, both the world's will and the previous incarnation of the worlds will knew exactly what was going on. This was clearly the characteristic of the suppressive force that Luo Fan had forcibly simulated through these tribulation realm experts. Through this simulation, these tribulation realm experts were able to slightly simulate the effect of the suppressive force at this moment. Currently, this force was much weaker than the suppressive force, and it was not as absolute as the suppressive force. However, it was still extremely extraordinary. For the tribulation realm experts, the effect was already powerful enough. At this moment, the huge formation began to change slightly. Waves of power began to gather out of thin air, turning into rays of strange light that ruthlessly struck the tribulation realm experts. In the blink of an eye, more than half of the tribulation realm experts' bodies collapsed, leaving only a bit of life essence in the void to endure the further damage of the light. However, it was clear that although the light was powerful, it was still limited. Although he had already destroyed the bodies of many tribulation stage powerhouses, they were still just bodies in the end. It was many times more difficult to erase the essence of life than to destroy the body. At least, with the power of the light, it was impossible to do so. Under such circumstances, although the life essence withstood the attack of the light, it did not waver. Instead, it began to continuously generate all kinds of matter and energy out of thin air to reconstruct its body. This reconstruction was not smooth. Every time it was constructed, it would be destroyed by the light and turned back into nothingness. However, a reconstruction was still a reconstruction. The appearance of this reconstruction meant that these tribulation realm experts were not powerless to withstand the attack. Good idea. However, it's still not enough. A leisurely sigh entered Luo Fan's ears. Immediately after, many tribulation realm experts who belonged to the previous incarnation of the worlds were suddenly enveloped by some invisible power. This power was extremely subtle, faintly discernible. After it appeared, it completely isolated the tribulation realm experts from the outside world. Along with this isolation, the terrifying pressure that the tribulation stage powerhouse was enduring disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had never appeared in the first place. Similarly, the tribulation ascendants, who belonged to the will of the world within the formation, also had their own methods. They seemed to have obtained some sort of authority from nothingness and forcibly separated themselves from the formation, completely freeing themselves from the effect of the formation. As expected, this kind of method is not enough to kill them all. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed to himself. However, he did not make any moves. To him, the tribulation realm experts had already laid down their foundations. There was no need for him to say anything about what to do next. These Tribulation Realm experts could make the right choice themselves, so there was no need for him to say anything. At this moment, within the formation, the Tribulation Realm powerhouses whose bodies had been destroyed and only had their life essences left trembled slightly, then regained their bodies. For Tribulation Ascendants, building a body and creating power were instincts among instincts. The reason why they were unable to rebuild their bodies before was because the formation was suppressing them. Now that the suppression of the formation had been isolated by a power that came out of nowhere, their instinctive function would naturally recover. That was why he was able to recover these bodies so easily, and also recover most of the power and power within them. At this moment, the formation that the Tribulation Realm experts on Luo Fan's side had set up turned, and they had already disappeared from the high-level battlefield with many Tribulation Realm experts. When they reappeared, they were already at the bottom of the battlefield, above their own army. After arriving here, the formation instantly enveloped Luo Fan's army. The betrayal and falling out with the incarnation of the worlds did not only happen in the high-level battlefield, but also in the low-level battlefield at the same time. Compared to the many Tribulation Realm experts in the high-level battlefield who were able to use the preparations they had made to almost reverse the situation and obtain the final victory, the situation in the low-level battlefield was clearly not as good. Here, Luo Fan's army was retreating step by step. Under the siege of the other two forces, a large number of casualties had occurred. The area that Luo Fan's army had originally occupied was being rapidly eroded by the other two forces. At this moment, the formation enveloped Luo Fan's army, as well as all the cultivators and living beings in the army. In an instant, an indescribable, subtle power was injected into the bodies of the cultivators and living beings, causing their injuries to recover in the blink of an eye. Of course, the dead were already dead and could not be revived so easily. After this change, the strength of Luo Fan's army skyrocketed, and they instantly turned the tables, directly taking revenge on the other two sides. In just a few short breaths, the situation had completely reversed. The former incarnation of the will of the world and the army of the will of the world had left behind a large number of casualties, and the territory that they had originally occupied was quickly regained. At this moment, the many Tribulation Realm experts in the high-level battlefield also realized where the experts on Luo Fan's side had gone. They quickly left the high-level battlefield and came to the low-level battlefield to face the Tribulation Realm experts on Luo Fan's side again, as well as the huge formation formed by the many Tribulation Realm experts. Although the formation had unified the power of the many Tribulation Realm experts, the overall power had not changed much compared to before. Under such circumstances, the power of the world's will and the incarnation of the worlds was actually still superior to that of Luo Fan's side. If the other two sides did not have any means to resist the formation, this side could naturally use the formation to easily deal with the individual strength of the other side, easily obtaining victory. However, it was obvious that the other two sides had backup plans left behind by their rulers. At this moment, the huge formation formed by the Tribulation Realm experts on Luo Fan's side was no longer of much use to them. In this way, it went without saying how bad the situation was for Luo Fan's side at this time. Chapter 2943. Luo Fan's decision shocked the former incarnation of the world's will. By the time it reacted, the situation in the thousands of worlds had already become irreversible. By the time the experts who were the incarnations of the will of the world arrived at those places, no matter how hard they tried, they could only watch helplessly as the experts on Luo Fan's side occupied those places, completely refined them, and changed their masters from then on. In the face of such a situation, the former incarnation of the worlds was naturally extremely displeased. However, things had already developed to this point, and it was already irreversible. The powerhouses on the former incarnation of the worlds could only gradually retreat. The masters of the world had changed, so those worlds had already become the home ground of the powerhouses on Luo Fan's side. Originally, these powerhouses on the away side could easily deal with the resistance in those worlds and refine them. Now that the away side had become the home ground, the strength they could unleash would naturally not be any weaker. Under such circumstances, there was no need to mention what the former incarnation of the worlds could do. The situation of this great battle had clearly reached a delicate juncture. The outcome of the first wave of attacks had already appeared, but more attacks were brewing. The situation had also become even more complicated because of the first wave of attacks. At this moment, whether it was Luo Fan, the world's will, or the former incarnation of the world's will, all of them could not help but shift their attention from the battlefield to the rudimentary battlefield karma that was constantly absorbing all the nutrients that could allow it to grow further. Although the previous battle did not truly determine a victor between Luo Fan's side, it could not be said that the battle was not intense. In such an intense battle, all sorts of nutrients formed by karma were constantly released. They were then frantically absorbed by the rudimentary battlefield karma that still existed in the world, transforming into the rudimentary battlefield karma. This caused the rudimentary battlefield karma to grow greatly in the previous battle. Although it was still only a rudimentary battlefield, it was clearly slightly more mature than before. Under such changes, the power of the rudimentary battlefield karma had increased by several times compared to before. At this time, Luo Fan and the others all simultaneously felt a kind of restriction from the embryonic form of war faintly acting on the three of them. It was as if some kind of invisible destiny wanted to bind them to a certain fixed orbit. It was precisely because of this sudden feeling that they simultaneously shifted their attention to the embryonic form of karma. Looks like the setup has succeeded. At this moment, a leisurely sigh sounded from the void. It was the voice of the world's will. Following this voice, the second wave of battle was instantly lifted. In the battlefield where the three sides were involved, the experts who belonged to the will of the world instantly turned hostile and began to attack the experts who had originally stood on his side and helped him fight against the experts on Luo Fan's side. They were the experts who belonged to the incarnation of the will of the world. That attack came in a hurry, but the former world will's avatar reacted instantly. Or rather, the experts on the side of the former world will's avatar reacted immediately. Or rather, the experts on the former world's will side reacted immediately and protected themselves immediately. The reason why the former world's will's incarnation was able to react so quickly was actually very simple. The reason why the former world's will's incarnation was able to react so quickly was actually very simple. It was because the incarnation of the world's will was extremely vigilant against the world's will. This extreme vigilance even affected the former world's will's incarnation, and they were also vigilant against the experts on the former world's will side at all times. Therefore, when the world's will's powerhouse launched an attack, they reacted immediately. This allowed them to react quickly during the process, greatly reducing the chance that they would be betrayed by the world's will and protecting themselves to the greatest extent. In a battle between three sides, if one or two of them were not rational enough and were blinded by emotions and short-term benefits, the outcome of the battle would naturally appear very quickly. The outcome of the battle would also be determined very quickly. However, if all three parties were extremely rational and knew what was the right thing to do and had the strength to carry it out, then the outcome of the battle between the three parties would be far away in the indefinite future. Clearly, whether it was Luo Fan, the world's will, or the former world's will's incarnation, all of them were able to view this battle with an extremely rational attitude. Under such circumstances, the outcome of this battle between the three sides would definitely not be determined in a short period of time. For example, the betrayal, and alliance in the first wave of battle could be said to be the true theme of this battle. Whether it was Luo Fan's side, the world's will's side, or the former world's will's incarnation, they would definitely choose this theme countless times in the upcoming battle that was likely to last for a long time. The second wave of attack was naturally no exception. In the beginning, the world's will side directly ignored the former world's will's goodwill in helping it deal with Luo Fan and directly attacked the former world's will's territory together with Luo Fan. wanting to conveniently destroy the former world's will side. Later on, because Luo Fan had turned around and helped the former world's will side, the former world's will side finally regained their footing and safety. Later on, because Luo Fan's performance was too powerful and he obtained too many benefits from the world's will, the former world's will side once again betrayed Luo Fan's side and turned around to help the former world's will side. Just like that, the enemies and allies constantly changed, and in the end, the three sides' attacks continued to entangle each other. The second wave of attack, the third wave of attack, the fourth wave of attack. Unknowingly, thousands of years had passed. In these thousands of years, the battle between Luo Fan's side and the other two sides had already gone through tens of thousands of waves. In these tens of thousands of waves of attacks that constantly changed, almost none of the three sides, including Luo Fan's side, could maintain victory. Whether it was Luo Fan, the world's will, or the former world's will's incarnation, all of them had tasted victory and defeat. Currently, among the three sides' territories, none of them could gain any advantage over the other two. Although the location of the territory had changed a little compared to before, the overall size and overall strength were not much different from before. It could be said that the situation from thousands of years ago was still the same. Of course, in the process, the number of living beings that died in the war was calculated in the trillions. At the border of the three sides' territories, it could be said that every inch of land had been soaked in flesh and blood. As the three battlefields spanning hundreds of millions of light years, due to the contamination of the flesh and blood, the region had unknowingly become independent. It was gradually separated from the outside world, becoming a separate entity that no longer interfered with the outside world. On this day, a strange rumble suddenly rang out in the void. This rumble spread throughout the battlefield that spanned hundreds of millions of light years, and even to the vast and boundless world outside the battlefield. Everyone in this area could clearly hear the sudden, mysterious, and strange rumble. Amidst this rumble, all living beings understood that the world had already undergone a fundamental change. A restriction that didn't exist before had truly taken shape in this part of the world. From today onwards, their fates and everything they had would be restricted by that existence. How could this be? At this moment, such a voice rang out at the same time from an unknown location in the void. The existences that spoke were different, but their choice of words, intonation, and tone were shockingly similar. It felt like the same person had said the same thing at different times. The one who said this was naturally the world's will, as well as the incarnation of the former world's will. At this moment, the reason why they said this was because they suddenly realized that the situation after the war karma had completely taken shape was quite different from what they had imagined. That's right. The sound that had suddenly spread throughout the world and entered the ears of all living beings was the movement of the war karma, when the embryonic form of the war karma had completely turned into the war karma. At this moment, the restriction that had appeared out of nowhere and affected everything in this world was the war karma. It turned out that according to the understanding of the world's will and the incarnation of the former world's will, even if the war karma had taken shape, it would only link the territory to the victory of the three sides. Apart from that, there would not be much difference. However, they did not expect that after the cause and effect of the war was formed, apart from linking the ownership of the territory to the outcome of the war between the three parties, there was a seemingly insignificant change that had an even greater impact on them. That change was that after the war karma had completely taken shape, they were no longer able to interfere with any changes in that world. Their original authority over that part of the world had been completely eliminated at this moment. Next, how large their territory would be, and whether they would be able to completely drive out the other two sides would depend on the world within their territory and the various experts within it. They were no longer able to take any action towards everything that was happening, nor were they able to make the slightest bit of change. In other words, their final fate could only be determined by the foundation that they had built for the world within their territory over the past thousands of years. If the foundation that they had built was strong enough, and their foundation was deep enough to allow the world within their territory to suppress the other two sides, they would naturally be able to obtain the greatest benefits in the end. However, if it was the other way around, if their foundation wasn't strong enough and their foundation wasn't deep enough, then the world within their territory wouldn't be able to completely suppress the other two sides. The final outcome would be the opposite. Of course, if it was the same for all three sides, although they would feel unhappy about losing control of their territory and placing their fate in the hands of the experts under them, they would not lose their composure. After all, if it was the same for all three sides, then it was still generally fair. Their chances of victory and defeat were about the same. Even if they were unhappy, they could still accept it. However, the current situation was not like this. Among the three sides, only the two of them had their connection with the world within their territory completely severed, and their authority over this world was completely restricted. On the other side, although Luo Fan's main body and clones were restricted, the clones that he had sent into his territory were not restricted at all. However, the clones that he had sent into his territory were not restricted at all. In other words, Luo Fan's clones could still control the heavens and earth, and could still guide the living beings in those heavens and earth to act according to his will. How could they not lose their composure in this situation? This was like an exam. Everyone had their books taken away, but not only did one of them not take away his books, even the reference answers were sent directly to him. One could only imagine how kept up that feeling was. Deducing from the results, they quickly understood what was going on. This was clearly because Karma had treated Luo Fan's avatar as a part of those worlds, and it didn't treat it as a part of Luo Fan. Understanding this, they could not help but feel a little regretful. They regretted that they did not put a part of themselves into those worlds during the great battle thousands of years ago. If they had done that back then, they would not be in such a terrible situation now. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he muttered, "It's really working." The arrangement of Karma of War was naturally not a natural arrangement. This was actually the result of him leaving some backup plans in the embryonic form of Karma of War. Chapter 2944. Of course, when the war karma was being constructed, both the will of the world and the former will of the world had left behind many contingencies, just like Luo Fan. It was even possible that most of those contingencies had already come into effect. But on the whole, it was obvious that the contingencies that Luo Fan had left behind were the most fundamental and most useful. At the very least, neither the will of the world or the former will of the world could allow them to directly participate in the upcoming war. But the contingencies that Luo Fan had left behind allowed him to directly participate in the upcoming war with his will of the world. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan had a reason to feel happy at this time. The war karma was constructed by Luo Fan and the other two with almost everything they had, so its power was naturally unimaginably powerful. Once it was completely formed, it would instantly release an unbelievable power and surpass the will of the world and the former will of the world to become the new ruler of this world. At this moment, Luo Fan's will of the world felt an indescribable sense of ease emerging from the depths of his heart. This kind of relaxation was a kind of relaxation formed by the complete relaxation of the suppression. In the past, Luo Fan's will of the world was almost omnipotent, even in a world that belonged to him and could easily surpass all tribulation stage experts. However, they could clearly feel an extremely powerful aura that even surpassed the scope of their understanding that pervaded the world. This sort of aura was faintly discernible, and it filled the entire world. It allowed him to clearly understand that he was extremely insignificant compared to the owner of this aura. As long as the owner of the aura was willing, he didn't even need to make a move. Just some specific changes to the aura would be enough to completely eliminate them. But at this moment, they discovered that the terrifying aura that filled the entire world had been completely isolated by an invisible existence. As long as the invisible existence continued to exist, then the owner of the aura, or even the aura itself, would no longer be able to cause any harm to them. With such a change, it was perfectly normal for them to feel relaxed, as if they had broken free from all suppression. Without the direct participation of the world will and the previous incarnations of the world will, Luo Fan's incarnations could be said to have become the most powerful beings on this battlefield. Previously, Luo Fan had only sent these clones into those worlds to guide the cultivators there to become Tribulation Realm experts. He had no intention of using these clones to directly participate in that big battle. Therefore, before this, these clones did not directly control great power. Everything they could do was only possible by borrowing the power and might of the world itself. Once they left the world where Luo Fan had placed his clones, although they would not lose all of their power, they would still lose all of their power. But at most, he was just like an ordinary expert below the tribulation stage. This kind of strength was obviously insignificant compared to the war that involved many tribulation stage powerhouses. In fact, it was precisely because of this restriction that the will of the world and the previous incarnations of the will of the world were not vigilant against these incarnations. They did not use any special methods to guard against these incarnations. If they were really vigilant against these incarnations, then Luo Fan's incarnation wouldn't be the only one left on this battlefield. The incarnations of the will of the world, the incarnations of the previous incarnations of the will of the world, and other similar existences would definitely not be lacking. If the situation remained the same as before, Luo Fan's clones naturally would not be able to obtain true power. After all, once he obtained such power, it would be equivalent to his real body participating in the battle, and the world will and the previous incarnations of the world would definitely take action personally. In that case, the power in the world would be compressed and reduced by the existence of Luo Fan's clones. On the other hand, at the highest level of Luo Fan's real body, Luo Fan would not be able to obtain sufficient advantages through such actions. Based on the senses of Luo Fan's clones, if he obtained great power and might that he could exert even if he left the world, the terrifying aura that permeated everything in the world would produce corresponding changes and destroy his clones. Such a choice was obviously not one that could be made up for the losses. Therefore, all along, Luo Fan's clones had been rather restrained and did not take the initiative to obtain any power that they could freely control. However, the situation now was obviously completely different from before. After discovering that the karma of war had completely controlled this great world, Luo Fan's clones quickly used his control over the world to knock a Tribulation Realm expert down and occupied the position that the expert had vacated. This action was very violent, but with his authority, no one in the world could stop him, and no one could resist him. After occupying the position of the Tribulation Realm expert, Luo Fan's clones began to rapidly grow stronger like a balloon. Very soon, they had become Tribulation Realm experts, and they began to continuously increase their strength through the tribulations. In a short span of a few dozen breaths, they had already surpassed all the Tribulation Initiation stage experts on the battlefield, brazenly stepping into the 6th Tribulation stage. This was because the tolerance of the world was limited. If the tolerance of the world was a little stronger, they might be able to break through the barrier between the 6th Tribulation Realm and the 7th Tribulation Realm, and step into the 7th Tribulation Realm. After all, the realm of Luo Fan's original body had already reached the level of a 7th Tribulation powerhouse. The realms between the clones and the main body were the same. The clones naturally understood what the main body understood as well. Under the situation where power could be created at will, and power could be constructed at will, once the realm was reached, the strength would naturally reach the same level. Of course, even so, the restrictions of the world itself were almost impossible to break through. A world that could accommodate the existence of 7 Tribulation Realm experts was obviously close to the tolerance limit of the simulated chaos state. In other words, even if it was a simulated chaotic state, the world that could be born would at most be able to accommodate cultivators at the 7 Tribulation level. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how difficult it was for the space-time that was born in a world to evolve into a world of this level. It could be said that even if all the conditions were perfect and all the environments were in place, it would still take billions of trillions of years for a space-time to evolve into a world of this level. This kind of time was not the time inside the space-time, but the time of the environment, unless, like in the simulated chaos state, the time of the outside environment was extremely chaotic. Obviously, the world that Luo Fan cultivated had existed for less than 10 million years, let alone billions of years. It had not even been 10,000 years since it started to evolve into a world. How could such a world be pushed to the tolerance limit of the simulated chaos state in such a short period of time? It was already an incredible achievement to be able to accommodate the existence of 6 Tribulation Realm experts to its current level. As for why such a short period of time could elevate the world to a level that could accommodate the existence of 6 Tribulation Realm experts, but elevating it to a higher level would require countless times more time, the reason was very simple. Just like learning, it was not difficult for most people to elevate from 0 to 60 points. However, to elevate from 90 to 100 points might not be a natural moat that an ordinary person could break through. Elevating the world to a level that could accommodate the existence of 6 Tribulation Realm experts was equivalent to elevating one score to 60 points. To elevate the world to a level that could accommodate the existence of 7 Tribulation Realm experts was obviously as difficult as elevating one score from 90 to 100 points. Hence, such a long period of time was needed. Of course, before that, it was meaningless to elevate the capacity from 6 Tribulation Realm experts to 7 Tribulation Realm experts. After all, so what if it could accommodate the existence of 7th Tribulation Realm experts? To cultivate a 7th Tribulation Realm expert in a world, the amount of time and energy needed was absolutely beyond the imagination of all living beings. Even if billions of trillions of years had passed in the outside world, and billions of trillions of years had passed in the world, it might not be possible to successfully cultivate one. If it was not so difficult, why would the true sages open up the true sage path in the big world to cultivate cultivators? Since even if the world's capacity was increased, it would not be able to produce a 7th Tribulation Realm expert. Then it was naturally meaningless to spend so much time to increase the world's capacity for cultivators. Therefore, at that time, Luo Fan and the other two sides unanimously chose not to continue to increase the world capacity for cultivators, but to start a war at this stage. Even the will of the world, which actually contained some 7 Tribulation Realm experts, did the same. After all, he clearly knew that he did not have enough time to increase the world to the point where it could accommodate 7 Tribulation Realm experts. Or to be more precise, 7 Tribulation Realm experts who opened up the world after Luo Fan's incarnation increased its realm. An incomparably terrifying aura seeped out of the world and began to connect with each other, covering the entire battlefield for billions of light years. In just an instant, this area, which was the battlefield of the 3 sides, had fallen into an abyss of suffering in the blink of an eye. Except for the world on Luo Fan's side, all the other world became unstable, as if they would completely collapse and be destroyed in the next moment. Unlike the world on Luo Fan's side, which had Luo Fan's incarnation guiding everything, clearly knowing the changes in the world situation, the other 2 worlds had no idea what had happened to the world at all. They only knew that the existence that had been guiding them through various mysterious ways had suddenly disappeared without a trace. This made them feel at a loss. They did not know what to do next, nor did they understand why such a change had happened. Under such circumstances, how could they gather any strength to resist the terrifying aura released by Luo Fan's incarnation? In just an instant, almost all the world was permeated by the aura of Luo Fan's incarnation, and all living beings began to bear the terrifying aura released by Luo Fan's incarnation. This aura was released by a 6 Tribulation Realm expert, and it was not just one 6 Tribulation Realm expert, but the terrifying aura released by hundreds of millions of 6 Tribulation Realm experts at the same time. Under such an aura, only some Tribulation Realm experts could still maintain their consciousness and resist to a certain extent. Apart from Tribulation Realm experts, the other cultivators were like statues under this aura. They could not move at all, and even their ability to think was completely suppressed by the aura. It could be said that in just an instant, Luo Fan's incarnation had obtained absolute dominance over a vast battlefield that spanned hundreds of millions of light years, allowing Luo Fan's side to obtain an initial victory. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation stepped out of the world they were in and appeared above the boundless ocean. Although they were extremely far away from each other, their minds were connected at this moment, as if they were one person. As 6 Tribulation Realm experts, they relied on their combined strength to forcibly imitate the supreme power of 7 Tribulation Realm experts. Destroy. A soft cry came from the mouths of Luo Fan's incarnation. Immediately after, the terrifying aura that covered many worlds instantly penetrated the depths of those worlds, forcibly wiping away all the imprints of Tribulation Realm experts that did not belong to him. With just this one change, the masters of those worlds had changed. The world could not accommodate 7 Tribulation Realm experts, which meant that the world could not give birth to a 7 Tribulation Realm expert. Thus, any 6 Tribulation Realm experts' breakthrough would be suppressed by all means. Any 6 Tribulation Realm expert would need to fight against the world if they wanted to become a 7th Tribulation Realm expert. In addition, this also meant that this world was extremely fragile to a 7th Tribulation Realm expert. At this moment, the terrifying aura formed by the countless auras of Luo Fan's incarnations forcibly imitated the aura of a 7th Tribulation Realm expert. As such, the heavens and earth would naturally become extremely fragile to the aura. Chapter 2945. With this aura alone, Luo Fan's incarnation had easily changed the owner of everything within billions of light years of this battlefield. This included the world within the territory of the world's will, as well as the world within the territory of the former incarnation of the world's will. It could be said that according to the settings at the beginning, Luo Fan could be said to have obtained the final victory in this 3-way battle and completely expanded his territory to every region of this great world. However, it was obvious that this battle, which the 3 parties had invested endless wisdom and energy into, would not end so easily. At the very least, the world's will and the former incarnation of the worlds would not be defeated so easily. If Luo Fan could leave behind a backup plan in the embryonic form of the karma of war, how could the world's will and the former incarnation of the worlds will not have any backup plans? Even though it seemed like the backup plan that Luo Fan had left behind was the most powerful, and it even felt like he had easily obtained the final victory, it did not mean that the backup plans of the other 2 parties were not powerful enough. In fact, this only meant that the backup plans of the other 2 parties were not in this aspect. At this moment, Luo Fan completely changed the owner of all the worlds in the 3 territories, refined them into his own, and turned all the power within them into his own power. However, after all these changes had calmed down, the territories that belonged to Luo Fan, which were the areas that had broken free from the shackles of the world's will, had only expanded to the area of this battlefield. Although this caused Luo Fan's territory to increase by an unknown number of billions of light years, this area of increase was not even comparable to the entire Great World. Even compared to the areas that had broken free from the shackles of the world's will, it did not occupy much of a proportion at all. Outside of this territory, in the wider world, there were still endless territories that didn't belong to him. This situation seemed to have already violated the setting of the karma of war. Luo Fan only needed one look to understand that this was caused by the world's will or the former incarnation of the worlds, that had left a backup plan in the embryonic form of the karma of war. Seeing this scene, although he felt a bit of regret in his heart, he didn't feel that it was unacceptable. If he could leave a backup plan in the embryonic form of war karma, the other 2 sides would naturally be able to leave a backup plan as well. Since his backup plan allowed him to obtain such a glorious result in this battlefield, wasn't it only natural that the other 2 sides obtained corresponding advantages from other angles? Immediately after, the karma of war seemed to move. As some sort of movement occurred, Luo Fan's avatar sensed a large amount of aura appearing out of thin air in two directions. He was very familiar with these auras. They were the auras of the heavens and earth that he had conquered just now. In other words, it was an aura that was essentially the same as those auras, but there was a slight difference in its appearance. There was no need to explain what this aura represented. Clearly, the territories that belonged to the world's will and the former incarnation of the worlds had once again been constructed. Moreover, compared to the territories that had been conquered in the past, the territories that had been rebuilt now were much wider. As the number of heavens and earth increased, the number of living beings in them naturally increased as well. In fact, Luo Fan's avatar could even sense the auras of tribulation ascending into the sky from afar. They were as conspicuous as smoke signals. So it's like this. It seems that it's impossible to finish this war in a short period of time. Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh as he felt the inexplicably familiar aura of a powerhouse. These tribulation ascending experts were none other than the auras of the world founders. Although the world founders that Luo Fan had conquered in the territories that belonged to the worlds were not the same batch, they were still world founders. It was precisely because they were all world founders that they had the common auras of world founders, which made Luo Fan feel an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Through these auras, Luo Fan already understood that the world will's backup plan was to place all the world founders under its control, or even all the world founders that existed in this world, on the karma of war. For the karma of war, all the world founders belonged to the world's will. As long as they didn't get rid of all the world founders in the war, then the world founders wouldn't be considered to have failed in this war. Even though all of their territories had been conquered, it was still the same. However, it was clear that it wasn't that easy to exploit the karma of war. Although the world founders had been placed on the karma of war, it gave the worlds convenience. But at the same time, because the world founders had been placed on the karma of war, the world founders could no longer be hidden by the world's will and hide in an absolutely safe place. Instead, they would be directly thrown into this great world under the influence of karma and directly participate in the war that was expected to be extremely long. It was precisely because of this that the world founders would voluntarily throw themselves into this world because of the karma of war. And because of the karma of war, they appeared not too far away from Luo Fan's territory. Although, in the eyes of Luo Fan's clone, those territories were actually quite far away from his own territory. However, if this distance was considered in terms of the size of the entire world, the two territories were simply like a small that was tightly pressed together. If this wasn't considered close, how could it be considered close? The territory of the former incarnation of the worlds appeared at a similar distance away at the same time, although it didn't have the terrifying aura of the world founders. However, there was a powerful aura that belonged to the former incarnation of the world's will. This aura enveloped those territories, linking the heavens and earth within those territories together. Through this connection, the heavens and earth finally became one, allowing the powers within to communicate with each other, allowing the power and the living beings within to interweave into unimaginable sparks of wisdom. In just a short period of time, tribulation stage powerhouses were born in those territories. Moreover, their growth rate was unimaginably fast, at least compared to the territories that had been conquered by Luo Fan's clone. The birth rate of tribulation stage powerhouses in those territories that belonged to the former incarnation of the worlds was over 100 times faster. The reason for this was that the incarnation of the former incarnation of the worlds had completely placed a portion of its power on the karma of war. Because of this, the outcome of the battle had already been completely linked to the aura of the individual. As long as its aura didn't disappear, it wouldn't be considered a failure even if its territory was completely destroyed. Of course, the loophole in the karma of war was not so easy to exploit. Although it had suppressed its aura, the incarnation of the former incarnation of the worlds had completely lost its ability to control these auras. although these auras belong to the incarnation of the former incarnation of the world's will. And if they were truly activated, they could even easily conquer all the worlds that participated in the war, just like the aura that Luo Fan's many incarnations had released together. However, in this war, the aura could only connect the many worlds together, allowing the many living beings in the world to have more exchanges and battles, triggering stronger sparks of wisdom, and allowing them to grow faster. It could be said that it was a waste of talent. Facing such an enemy, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't be polite, although their various methods seemed to be quite brilliant, and it could be said that they had maximized their advantage in maneuvering space in a battle. Their backup plan was still inferior. At this moment, in this battlefield, it was still Luo Fan's incarnation that had the strength to surpass everything. In this way, even if they maximized their advantages, they would only be able to delay the outcome of their defeat as much as possible. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation began to directly lead the army towards the two territories. After completely conquering the worlds that belonged to the other two sides on this battlefield, the combat foundation of Luo Fan's side had now increased by several times. With such a foundation, the expedition did not pose much pressure to him. On the other hand, the logistical supplies were definitely more than enough. A distance of hundreds of millions of light years was not considered close to the cultivator army. It took them almost a month to arrive at the territory of the will of the heavens and earth. This was a brand new territory that was many times larger than the previous one. The number of worlds was more than 10,000 times that of the previous one. Even if a world had one tribulation stage powerhouse, there would be hundreds of trillions of tribulation stage powerhouses. At this moment, so many tribulation stage powerhouses looked at Luo Fan's incarnation and his army from afar, and all of them looked extremely solemn. In the process of Luo Fan's incarnation leading the army on the journey for a month, the world creators in this territory did not stay still. Although they did not have the guidance of the world's will, they were still controlled by the karma of war, and they instinctively knew that the enemy was coming. They also vaguely understood that the enemy's strength was beyond their imagination. Therefore, in this month, they had been working hard to prepare for the upcoming war every moment. Now, they had vaguely formed a huge formation with each other. A formation formed by hundreds of trillions of tribulation stage powerhouses was so grand that it was simply beyond the imagination of any existence. In terms of size alone, even the combined forces of all of Luo Fan's incarnations were far from comparable to it. These tribulation stage powerhouses glared at Luo Fan and the others, and their auras gradually began to merge. In a trance, there seemed to be an indomitable giant figure that filled all space-time, looking at Luo Fan and the others coldly in the sky. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation naturally did not have any reaction. Although such an aura was shocking in size, it was not on the same level at all. To him, it was like a cool breeze. However, this aura was nothing to Luo Fan's incarnation, but was not so easy for his subordinates. At this moment, many cultivators in the army looked as if they had lost their parents, and some of their bodies almost could not withstand the pressure of the aura. Cracking sounds kept coming from their bodies. It gave people a feeling that they could not bear the burden and would completely collapse and die in the next moment. It could be said that if it weren't for the fact that the army had a formation and that all the cultivators who joined the army had a corresponding aura and strength, just the pressure from the aura alone would be enough to kill 90% of the cultivators in the army. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's incarnation's expression naturally froze. At this moment, the auras of the many incarnations resonated and finally merged into one, forming an extremely terrifying aura. The aura that belonged to a seventh tribulation powerhouse gradually spread out from the merged aura and began to suppress the huge formation formed by hundreds of trillions of tribulation stage powerhouses. Although the overall size of the formation formed by hundreds of trillions of tribulation stage powerhouses was extremely shocking, most of them had only just stepped into the tribulation stage. Apart from the world creators, it was extremely rare to reach the second or third tribulation. Even those who could reach the fifth tribulation and sixth tribulation were the minority among the minority. Under such circumstances, one could imagine how high the level of the whole formation formed by the gathering of so many tribulation stage powerhouses would be. Compared to those below the tribulation realm, this level was naturally unstoppable. However, for the whole formation formed by hundreds of millions of Luo fans' incarnations, it was far inferior. Don't forget that Luo fans' incarnations were all at the sixth tribulation level due to the restrictions of the world. There is no need to say who was stronger when compared to the whole formation formed by hundreds of millions of sixth tribulation stage powerhouses, which had a large number of fifth or sixth tribulation stage powerhouses. Chapter 2946. Faced with such a huge disparity in strength, Luo fans' incarnation was naturally extremely relaxed at this moment. The formation formed by billions of tribulation initiation powerhouses might seem powerful at this moment, but it was completely ineffective against Luo fans' incarnations. At this moment, that terrifying aura was like a wave that had encountered a reef. Although it looked astonishing, it did not affect the reef in the slightest. Instead, the reef became even more shiny and slippery as the wave passed by. Luo Fan's incarnation became relaxed, so he naturally had more energy to spare. He began to expand his aura to cover the entire army. As their auras enveloped the entire army, the terrifying auras that the army felt from the billions of Tribulation Realm powerhouses were like a gentle breeze. They could no longer pose a threat to any of the living beings or cultivators within. So strong. The same thought appeared in the minds of countless Tribulation Ascendants. At this moment, they finally knew where the warning in their hearts came from. The enemy in front of them seemed to be far inferior to their side in terms of size, but their strength was far stronger than theirs. At this moment, they could clearly feel the despair coming from the other side. Originally, the countless experts felt disdain towards the warning signs that appeared in their hearts. Although according to the timeline of this great world, it had only been a short month since the birth of these ascended tribulation experts from nothingness. However, because of the independence of the world, the lifespan of these heavenly calamity cultivators in the world they were born in was calculated in billions of years. After such a long time, their minds had long been tempered to be as hard as a rock. Under such circumstances, how could they not have confidence in their side when there were billions of tribulation initiation powerhouses on their side? Before they saw Luo Fan's incarnations, they were completely convinced that the countless worlds on their side were all the worlds they knew. All the worlds could even be said to be everything. Outside these countless worlds, there might be some lost pearls in the sea, but they were just insignificant worlds. Compared to the myriad worlds that they knew of, it was insignificant. With this mindset, they had a premonition that enemies would come from the outside world. How could they take it seriously? The fact that they were able to unite all the Tribulation Realm experts as a whole and form a formation was already a sign that they respected the premonition of danger that they had vaguely sensed. But now, they finally understood that they were merely frogs at the bottom of a well. Outside of the myriad heavens and realms, there might be countless individuals similar to the myriad heavens and realms. In fact, there were even more grand existences above these countless individuals that were similar to the heavens and the 10,000 worlds. If that wasn't the case, such a terrifying enemy wouldn't have appeared. At this time, Luo Fan's clones took action again. Powerful auras were released from their bodies and pressed down on the auras of the Tribulation Realm cultivators in front of them. This pressure was like a knife cutting through butter. It was incomparably smooth, and it had already directly cut open the imposing aura. Immediately after, the terrifying aura pressed down on the true bodies of the Tribulation Realm experts. At this moment, the Tribulation Realm experts seemed to have turned into ordinary people, facing the pressure of an indomitable supreme god. Their bodies tightened up, and all the strength in their bodies seemed to have been completely sucked away. Even their minds became hazy and dazed. These Tribulation Realm experts didn't know how long they had been in this dazed state. In this state, they had completely lost the concept of time. For them, there was no difference between an instant and a trillion years. When they came back to their senses, they found that they had already become prisoners. They were no longer surrounded by the boundless myriad heavens realm sea. In the eyes of these tribulation realm experts, there were only the numerous worlds that belonged to the will of the world. Even the creators of the world didn't know the truth of this world because they had been sealed long ago. Therefore, for them, these seas that carried countless worlds were incomparably wonderful realm seas. In other words, the myriad heavens realm sea, the place where they had already become a void. It was a boundless void that they had no idea how vast it was with their perception. It was a void that they couldn't break through with their strength at all. The endless number of tribulation realm experts that they could faintly sense in their own world had completely disappeared at this moment. It seemed that they were the only ones left in the universe, as well as the endless void around them. Apart from these two, everything else seemed to have completely ceased to exist. This change instantly horrified countless tribulation realm experts. They couldn't be more clear about what this meant. Either what they sensed was real, or the myriad heavens realm sea, and the countless other tribulation realm experts had completely perished in that unknown period of time. At this time, only they and the endless void were left in the myriad heavens realm sea and even the myriad heavens. Or they had been completely imprisoned, and everything they sensed now was just what the other party wanted them to sense. Obviously, no matter which possibility it wasn't a good thing for them. It was precisely because of this that the tribulation realm experts were so horrified at this moment. At this moment, Luo Fan's clones were all beaming with joy. At this moment, a huge three-legged cauldron floated in the void in front of them. Countless tribulation realm experts were trapped in the cauldron like layers of a beehive. Every tribulation ascendant had a small, independent space in it. These spaces might appear to be boundless void from the inside, but from the outside, they could only accommodate their bodies. At this moment, an indescribable suction force was being generated in these spaces, constantly absorbing the power of the tribulation realm experts trapped in those spaces and channeling the power into the three-legged cauldron, strengthening and sublimating the cauldron with every passing moment. The cauldron was turning the countless tribulation realm experts into a source of power, using their power to continuously refine the three-legged cauldron and provide it with enough power. At this moment, the power of the three-legged cauldron was multiplying by several times every second. In just a few hours, it had risen from 0 to the level of a tribulation realm expert. Moreover, it was transforming into a higher-level tribulation at an unimaginable speed. Very soon, the three-legged cauldron had reached the level of a 7th tribulation realm expert. This had completely surpassed Luo Fan's clones. But even so, the three-legged cauldron's essence did not stop growing and sublimating. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron was rising at an unimaginable speed, constantly approaching the limit of a 7th tribulation realm expert. In just a few short days, he had already brazenly touched that limit. An indescribable feeling of perfection began to gradually radiate from the three-legged cauldron. Along with this feeling of perfection, the three-legged cauldron looked like it was naturally formed. There was nothing on it that wasn't perfect, nothing that wasn't mysterious, and nothing that wasn't harmonious. Waves of indescribable fluctuations were released from the three-legged cauldron. Along with these fluctuations, the so-called myriad worlds that belonged to the will of heaven and earth became warm and stagnant. It was as if it had been completely suppressed. This region was more than 1,000 times larger than the previous territory of the will of heaven and earth. The world contained in such a vast region was tens of thousands of times larger than the previous territory of the will of heaven and earth. Once these countless worlds were conquered, it would obviously be a great supplement for Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's clones didn't make any moves and only controlled the three-legged cauldron. Under their control, the three-legged cauldron had already arrived at the center of the myriad worlds in a flash. Countless ripples were constantly being emitted from it, seeping into the surrounding heavens and earth, causing the essence of those heavens and earth to change. After a few days, all the changes were completed, and the owner of these worlds had completely changed to Luo Fan. Following the change of the masters of the world, this so-called myriad worlds completely broke free from the shackles of the will of the world and became exactly the same as the regions in Luo Fan's territory. Evidently, the war karma had started to take effect. It had completely linked the ownership of this region to the previous war. However, it was clear that the world creators that appeared here were not all of the world creators that the will of heaven and earth possessed. Even if Luo Fan had completely dealt with this region and turned it into his own, the war karma still did not completely turn the entire world into his. It was because the war karma still did not completely turn the entire world into his, nor did it completely change the owner of this world to him. At this moment, in the extremely far distance, beyond the range of Luo Fan's senses, there was a strange and familiar aura that appeared once again. That was clearly the territory of the will of heaven and earth that had once again appeared in this region. However, compared to the territory that Luo Fan had just conquered, this new territory that belonged to the will of heaven and earth was even further away. If it wasn't for the karma, he wouldn't even know that it had appeared, nor would he know that it was in the direction that he had sensed it from. Looks like it will become more and more difficult. Luo Fan vaguely sensed all of this and felt a little strange. However, he quickly calmed himself down. After all, this was actually a matter of course. Since the will of heaven and earth and the incarnation of the former will of heaven and earth had set up a backup plan, they naturally expected that their backup plan would be suppressed by the other party. Just like Luo Fan, he had already prepared for the possibility that his backup plan would not succeed or be as effective as the other two's backup plans. Therefore, the will of heaven and earth and the incarnation of the former will of heaven and earth clearly had plans for how to deal with failure, how to guard against it, and how to find an opportunity to win from failure. At this time, if they failed, they would set up a territory further away so that the world and the territory would have a longer period of time to develop and gain more time to prepare. This was something that could not be more natural. With a thought, he focused his attention on the territory that the incarnation of the former will of heaven and earth had. Although the territory that the will of heaven and earth had just been born seemed to require more attention and was more threatening, it did not mean that the territory of the former will of heaven and earth did not pose any threat. After all, the territory of the former will of heaven and earth was already born when the territory of the former will of heaven and earth was already formed. At this time, they were still growing at an unimaginable speed. Under such circumstances, if he did not pay attention to them, they might grow to an unimaginable level at some point and give birth to experts that could threaten Luo Fan's many incarnations. Therefore, it was obvious that he had to seize the time to conquer the territory of the former will of heaven and earth. With the three-legged cauldron, the territory of the former will of heaven and earth was clearly weaker than the territory of the former will of heaven and earth. From a moment Luo Fan made up his mind to conquer the territory to the moment Luo Fan completely conquered it, the entire process only took 10 days. Almost 99% of the time was spent on the army's journey. If it were not for the fact that the army needed time to travel, it would only take 1 to 4 hours for Luo Fan's many incarnations to completely conquer the territory. As the territory was conquered, the number of tribulation stage experts in the three-legged cauldron nearly doubled. Furthermore, its might had also grown increasingly powerful. Chapter 29:47. Although its essence could not continue to improve, it was not without benefits to the three-legged round cauldron by continuously replenishing more tribulation stage powerhouses. At the very least, with the addition of these tribulation stage powerhouses, the three-legged round cauldron's power had become more and more absolute. The power and might that it could instantly release had also become more and more powerful. Time passed, and before he knew it, 1,000,000 years had passed. In these 1,000,000 years, Luo Fan's territory had expanded more than 100 times compared to before. In other words, the area that had already broken free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth had expanded more than 100 times. The size of the area that had expanded by 100 times was still not considered much compared to the entire great world, but it was no longer as insignificant as before. In the past, the size of the area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth was only equivalent to the size of a needle tip compared to the entire world. But now, after it had expanded by 100 times, it had changed from the size of a needle tip to the size of a finger. For the human body, a wound that was the size of a needle tip usually did not matter unless it hit a vital point. It was extremely easy to recover from it. However, when the wound expanded to the size of a finger, the situation was completely different. The possibility of a finger-sized wound worsening had obviously increased significantly. If the depth was too deep and the location of the attack was not right, there was a possibility that it would be fatal. And don't forget that the area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth corresponded to the hole in the space-time where the will of heaven and earth resided. Now that the area had expanded to such an extent, it meant that there was a similar hole in the space-time where the will of heaven and earth resided. Such a hole was obviously an excellent starting point for Luo Fan. Over the years, although Luo Fan's territory had been continuously expanding, in fact, Luo Fan's real body did not need to worry about how the territory was expanding at all. His true body, on the other hand, could wholeheartedly do what he wanted to do and target the enemies he wanted to target. Obviously, the will of heaven and earth was his current greatest enemy. Of course, even if he wanted to participate, he did not have the ability to do so. The karma of war wasn't something that could be easily dealt with. And at this moment, when the hole in space and time where the will of heaven and earth resided finally surpassed a certain boundary, Luo Fan finally took action. His avatar, which was formed with the help of the power related to the true divine, had already arrived in the depths of the void in a flash, arriving in front of the hole where the will of the universe resided. Compared to before, this hole was more than 100 times larger. Even the hole back then required billions of light years to calculate. So the size of this hole was naturally even more shocking and terrifying. At this moment, there was a huge seal that was completely formed by countless strange lines and patterns floating in the middle of the hole. Endless lines and patterns were constantly emitted from the seal and spread towards the vast hole, completely blocking it. At the edge of the hole that had completely exceeded the limits of Luo Fan's vision, endless power was constantly surging, trying its best to break the edge of the hole and break the endless lines and patterns that filled the hole. It wanted the hole to return to its original appearance of a space-time barrier. However, it was a pity that no matter how powerful and vast the power outside was, it was unable to shrink the hole in the slightest. It was as if the size of the hole was determined by a higher and more unbelievable existence. If one wanted to shrink the hole, they had to first break that existence, and that existence was obviously the karma of the war. At this moment, it seemed like the seal that Luo Fan had constructed was blocking the hole from shrinking again. But in fact, the only function of the seal now was to allow Luo Fan to still have complete control over everything in the hole. It did not provide any help in maintaining the hole. Just like at this moment, the reason why Luo Fan could see the endless power surging at the edge of the hole outside of his vision was because of the power of the seal itself. If not for the existence of the seal, he might have been able to forcibly release his perception to sense everything. How could he be as relaxed as now? How could he see clearly? At this moment, a huge vortex could be vaguely seen surging behind the hole. You want to bypass karma to attack me? An inexplicable voice came from the faintly discernible giant vortex. In this voice, Luo Fan could not hear any negative emotions, such as anger at all. There was only calmness and calmness. It was as if everything was under his control and everything did not matter to him. Even if it concerned his own life, it was the same. Obviously, this is a good opportunity, isn't it? Luo Fan said faintly. As he spoke, the three-legged cauldron appeared beside him. With a slight tremble, A boundless suppressive force directly cut into the hole like a knife cutting butter. In the past, the hole was way too small compared to the entire space-time. If one wanted to hurt the thing inside through the hole, it would be like an ant trying its best to drill into the person's body through a needle-sized wound. It was completely impossible. Just the contraction of the person's muscles would be enough to completely block the wound and isolate the inside from the outside. Therefore, even though the size of the hole from before was calculated in trillions of light years, it was completely impossible to damage the thing behind the space-time through that hole. At this moment, the wound had expanded to the size of a finger, and the situation was clearly completely different. A finger-sized wound was clearly beyond the scope of what muscle contraction could cover. No matter how much the surrounding muscles contracted, there would definitely be a gap in such a wound. If the ant wanted to drill into the hole and attack the inside of the body, such a wound would obviously be more than enough. Just like at this moment, the hole in the space-time in front of him was like this. At this moment, the faintly discernible appearance of the vortex inside the space-time through the hole was the best proof of this fact. At that moment, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. He controlled the three-legged cauldron, allowing its suppressive power to break through the hole. In the end, it passed through the hole and charged towards the vortex within the space-time. Although the suppressive force came from the three-legged round cauldron, in essence, it came from the material of the three-legged round cauldron. In other words, it came from the power related to the true divine. It was just like a blade. You could say that it was only because it was sharpened that it had such great lethality and could easily cut anything into pieces. This indeed made sense. However, for this blade to be able to cut through iron as if it were mud, and to be able to cut through steel and iron, it obviously depended on the material it was forged from. If it was just ordinary pig iron, then it would be wishful thinking for this knife to slice through iron as if it were mud. It was the same for the three-legged cauldron. Although the structure of the three-legged cauldron itself was exquisite enough, and the suppressive force released by it was pure enough and powerful enough, it was not enough. However, it was just like sharpening a knife to be sharp enough. What it could really harm and what it could be used against depended on the material of the three-legged round cauldron and the power related to the true divine. The effect of the suppressive force was extremely shocking. As long as there was a slight connection, it would be affected and suppressed. For example, if a small part of the will of heaven and earth was suppressed by the suppressive force, the entire will of heaven and earth would be suppressed unless that small part was completely cut off and the connection between it and the main body was completely severed. At that moment, the suppressive force was frantically suppressing the vortex that existed behind the hole. It was trying its best to completely suppress the vortex. Luo Fan could also clearly feel that the power released by the three-legged round cauldron was coming into contact with and suppressing something. That kind of subtle rebounding ability, the ability to resist, was so clear in his senses. They clearly told him that the suppressive force of the three-legged round cauldron was suppressing something. Faced with such a situation, an indescribable expression appeared on his face, and an indescribable smile appeared on his face. "It seems like what you were hoping for didn't happen," he said. At that moment, his expression suddenly changed. This was because he suddenly realized that behind the hole, the faintly discernible vortex seemed to still be active. There were no changes at all like before, as if nothing had happened. This was obviously impossible. He felt that the suppressive force had clearly suppressed something, and that something could only be the vortex, the will of heaven and earth. He frowned and once again activated the three-legged round cauldron, causing the suppressive force to undergo countless changes. Under these changes, the power of the suppressive force released by the three-legged round cauldron did not increase by much, but it was bestowed with an ability that it did not possess before. As this new ability was bestowed with the suppressive force, Luo Fan felt as if the suppressive force had turned into his eyes, allowing him to clearly see the thing that was being suppressed. It was an incomparably huge whirlpool. Even with his eyesight and senses, it was difficult for him to see or sense it clearly. The familiar aura coming from the vortex was the will of heaven and earth. It was exactly the same as the will of heaven and earth that he had come into contact with before, according to this aura and appearance. It was indeed the will of heaven and earth. It was indeed the existence that he had spoken to just now. However, why was the will of heaven and earth that he sensed with the help of the suppressive force acting completely differently from the will of heaven and earth that his clone saw? Through his perception of the suppressive force, the will of heaven and earth had already been completely suppressed. However, in the eyes of this clone, the will of heaven and earth did not change at all. It was as if nothing had happened. How could this be? At this moment, Luo Fan finally felt that things were somewhat out of his control. How many times do you think I have directly attacked you in the past 1,000,000 years? At this moment, the voice of the will of heaven and earth rang in Luo Fan's ears again. 300,000 times. Every few years, I will make a move against you. Every time, I would completely suppress you completely and even erase you completely. However, you are still alive and well, and you do not even know that I have attacked you all these years. Upon hearing this, the expression on Luo Fan's face finally became extremely ugly. At this moment, he slowly retracted his suppressive force and said, "Is it because of the interaction between our trump cards?" This situation was indeed beyond his imagination, but he did not think that the will of heaven and earth would lie. There was no point in lying at this moment. Moreover, he instinctively believed that the will of heaven and earth should not be the kind of existence that would lie. At this moment, since it said that it had attacked him hundreds of thousands of times in the past 1,000,000 years, it meant that it had definitely done so. During the process, he really did not feel that it had attacked him, so the situation was obviously worth pondering. Actually, there was no need to think too much about the reason. Apart from the karma of war, it was absolutely impossible for any other force to be involved. In other words, it was obvious that the karma of war had allowed him to remain unscathed after hundreds of thousands of attacks in the past 1,000,000 years. Back then, when the three parties had set up the karma of war, they clearly did not set it in this aspect. Now that such a setting had appeared, it meant that the abnormality had already occurred. This is the only explanation. At this moment, a voice appeared not far away. Then, a middle-aged man appeared where the voice came from. This middle-aged man was naturally the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth. Chapter 29:48. The place fell silent. After a long while, the worlds will sighed and said, "You finally dare to appear before me. Of course, since we can't hurt each other anymore, I naturally dare to appear before you." The middle-aged man smiled faintly at this moment, completely ignoring the mockery in the world's will's words. "It seems that we should be able to get along peacefully in the next tens of millions of years," Luo Fan said faintly. He naturally had no intention of getting involved in the conflict between the world's will and the incarnation of the world's will. At this moment, what he was concerned about was how the three of them would get along in the near future. Tens of millions of years? Perhaps it won't be as long as you think. The incarnation of the worlds will smiled at this moment. Luo Fan looked at the middle-aged man thoughtfully, only to see that the middle-aged man didn't have a worried expression on his face at this moment, only a calmness, as if everything was within his control. It was as if the current situation wasn't a bad one for him, but a situation where everything was developing smoothly according to the direction he had expected. This wouldn't be surprising in the past, but at this moment, when the battle situation was completely tilted towards Luo Fan's side, and both sides were completely powerless to resist and could only retreat step by step, his behavior was very difficult to understand. "It seems that you found a way to bypass the restriction of karma again." Soon, Luo Fan thought of such a possibility. At this moment, the world's will's voice sounded. "Then let's see whose method is more brilliant." It was obvious that he had also found a way to bypass the restriction of karma in the past millions of years. Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression slightly froze. Then, he suddenly smiled and said, "All right, then I'll wait and see." The current situation on the battlefield couldn't be any better for him. It could be said that his incarnations had already laid an extremely deep foundation for him in the past millions of years. No matter what plans the worlds will and the incarnation of the worlds will had, they must first go against the foundation he had laid. It could be said that he was currently standing in a position where he was being challenged. Since that was the case, what reason did he have to be in a state of panic just because of a few words from the other party? As he spoke, he couldn't be bothered to waste any more time here. He turned around and left. In the blink of an eye, he had already returned to the world below and entered the world of laws. He came to where his true body was, which was also where the power related to the true saint was. He released his own power and tried his best to communicate with the power related to the true saint, resonating with it, and trying his best to absorb the strands of power that belonged to the power related to the true saint at the same time. His mind spread out and merged with his clones that could participate in the war. Through those clones, he began to make subtle adjustments to the world that belonged to him. At this time, the number of worlds belonging to Luo Fan had already increased by tens of thousands of times. There were so many of them that they had already surpassed the understanding of the beings that were born in those worlds. For the beings that were born in those worlds, their location was the boundless boundary sea. In the boundless boundary sea, there were endless worlds. In their understanding, the number of these worlds wasn't something that anyone could accurately know, not even tribulation experts. It could be said that if it wasn't for Luo Fan's incarnation guiding everything, the beings that were born in those worlds might have already lost the possibility of the war continuing. After all, if they didn't even know the scale of all the worlds and what kind of power existed in those worlds, who would care about the so-called enemies outside the boundary sea? Who would want to fight against the enemies outside the boundary sea? Not to mention anything else. Just the infinite resources contained in the boundless worlds and the boundary sea were enough for them to ignore everything and ignore any resources that might exist in the outside world. Of course, at this time, with Luo Fan's incarnation guiding and controlling everything, the situation naturally wouldn't deteriorate to that extent. At this time, as Luo Fan adjusted, the various powers of the worlds communicated with each other. Many tribulation experts that were born from the countless worlds began to gradually gather, forming a dense and overwhelming group of cultivators that appeared in front of Luo Fan's incarnation. This time, Luo Fan did not gather them to form an army to fight against the others. Instead, it was to guard against the possible enemies that might appear or some kind of change that might occur. Although he wouldn't panic because of the words of the world's will and the incarnation, it didn't mean that he could completely ignore their threat. Strategically, he looked down on them, but tactically, this was what he should do. At this time, he had as many incarnations gather the tribulation experts to guard against the enemy and any changes. This was clearly a form of tactically attaching importance. Of course, Luo Fan didn't let the tribulation realm powerhouses stay idle while they were on alert. To him, the existence of these tribulation experts represented all sorts of possibilities. Over the years, he had been constantly engaged in war. He was either on the battlefield or on his way to the next battlefield. However, during this process, he didn't neglect the nurturing of these tribulation experts. It could be said that he was using all sorts of methods to instill all sorts of principles and mysteries of cultivation into these tribulation experts at every moment. Because of this, compared to more than 1,000,000 years ago, the average level of these tribulation experts had greatly increased. Back then, the average level of the tribulation experts was only at the level of the first or second tribulation experts. But now, the average level of the tribulation experts had already reached the level of the third or fourth tribulation experts. The magnitude of this increase was clearly beyond the imagination of any rational person. Originally, even if these tribulation experts spent billions of years in their own world, it wouldn't be enough for them to raise their cultivation by one tribulation. But now, in just 1,000,000 years, who knew how many trillions of tribulation experts had raised their cultivation by 2 tribulations? The disparity in speed had almost reached an unreal level. However, this seemingly unreal improvement was actually a very normal change. After all, these tribulation experts have been constantly winning in the past 1,000,000 years. The karma of war spread throughout this great world, and it had even completely cut off the control of the worlds all over this world. It was self-evident how powerful it was. Luo Fan's incarnations led them to victory again and again, but they triggered the karma of war again and again, constantly transforming this world's territory and assimilating it with the territory that Luo Fan previously controlled. This process seemed to have no effect on the improvement of cultivators. But in fact, the effect on the improvement of cultivators was beyond imagination. The nature of the region of the world had completely changed from being under the shackles of the world to being free from the shackles of the world. This was simply the karma of war demonstrating to them again and again how to change the nature of the great world, demonstrating again and again how to break free from the shackles and how to break the reality. It could be said that every time the karma of war changed the nature of the world, it was equivalent to a heaven-defying opportunity. This kind of opportunity repeated again and again, and it had happened tens of thousands of times in the past million years. How could the improvement of these tribulation experts be slow? It was precisely because of this convenience that these tribulation experts were able to raise their cultivation by 2 tribulations on average over the past million years. At this time, Luo Fan's incarnation gathered many tribulation realm powerhouses around him. It was as if Luo Fan's incarnation was gathering them to preach the Tao. He only talked about the principles of heaven and earth, the mysteries of cultivation, and slowly improved their foundation, increasing their accumulation and cultivation. For those who had entered the tribulation, this was a day that they could only dream of. All the tribulation experts were familiar with Luo Fan's incarnation. After all, the reason why they could become tribulation experts back then was because of Luo Fan's incarnation guiding them bit by bit. To them, now that Luo Fan's incarnation was preaching to them, it made them feel like they had returned to the past. They had returned to the days when they were born and worked hard to seek a breakthrough in the world they were born in. The only difference was that there were more students around them who were listening to the lecture with them. While Luo Fan's incarnation was preaching to the tribulation experts and working hard to increase their foundation, the world outside Luo Fan's territory began to undergo an extremely intense change. At a certain moment, the boundless heavens and earth filled the world, and they spread out towards the boundless and distant horizon. Compared to the endless world, the vast territory that Luo Fan had occupied for more than 1,000,000 years was like comparing a ping-pong table to a ping-pong table. In just an instant, the territory of this colossus seemed to have become incomparably small. It seemed to have been completely surrounded, and there was no gap left. The change was so sudden that Luo Fan couldn't even react for a moment. Is this their backup plan? That's all. Luo Fan's incarnation was quite surprised at this moment. Although the influence of the main body and the incarnation on the battlefield had been completely isolated, it didn't mean that the connection between the main body and the incarnation had been completely severed. Therefore, Luo Fan's incarnation was now clearly aware of the communication process between the incarnation and the world's will and the incarnation of the world's will. Previously, he was also worried that the incarnation and the worlds would do something incredible to bypass the restrictions of the karma of war. But now, after discovering so many space-times around him, he suddenly felt that it was a little ridiculous. Was it just an increase in numbers? If that was the case, he would be too disappointed. It should be known that these incarnations of Luo Fan were all existences at the peak of the sixth tribulation. Just one of these beings was enough to shake the heavens and the earth, not to mention that there were hundreds of millions of them here now. With so many experts at the peak of the sixth tribulation agreeing to gather in one place, the strength and power that could be exerted had reached an incredible level. It was almost a matter of course for them to surpass the sixth tribulation level. At this moment, although there were endless worlds around him, their levels were at most similar to the worlds in his current territory. The only ones that could withstand it were experts at the peak of the sixth tribulation level. Under such circumstances, even if those six tribulation powerhouses had a way to gather their power together, even if they had a way to stimulate each other and raise their overall level, compared to Luo Fan's incarnation, they would definitely not be able to compare and level. However, if one's level couldn't be compared, then any of the experts in those heavens and earth would be incomparably weak ants in front of Luo Fan's incarnation. As long as Luo Fan's incarnation was willing, he could easily deal with any of the worlds in an extremely short period of time. As for the countless experts who had entered the tribulation, they would definitely be able to easily suppress any one of them. In that case, so what if there were more of these worlds? To Luo Fan, it was just a matter of a few more times. Therefore, if the other party really only had this kind of method, then Luo Fan would obviously feel extremely disappointed. He felt that his vigilance and vigilance at this moment were just for show. However, very soon, the endless worlds that surrounded his territory began to faintly undergo some subtle changes. All the worlds began to faintly unite into one. It was as if some indescribable existence was using some unimaginable means to forcefully knead the endless heaven and earth into a complete entity. Chapter 2949. This process, which was similar to breathing, allowed the countless worlds to finally become one. Every world was supporting all the other worlds at all times. At the same time, every world was also supported by all the other worlds at all times. The disappointment on Luo Fan's face lessened a little when he sensed this scene with his authority. It was obvious that the changes that had happened to these worlds were just the beginning. Next, there would definitely be new changes in the many worlds. And these new changes might be the reason why the worlds was confident that they could pose a threat to him. Of course, at this time, he did not sit back and watch as the worlds prepared for further changes. Under the guidance of his will, countless talismans appeared out of thin air at the border of the two territories, and they transformed into numerous profound and marvelous formations. It was naturally extremely difficult to build a teleportation formation in an area that he did not control. After all, it was easy to build a formation, but it was not easy to point the formation at where it was directed. The situation was obviously completely different in an area that was completely under his control. Now, this area was completely Luo Fan's territory. For him, he could manipulate everything unknown in this area at will. Naturally, it was an extremely easy task for him to set up the formation between two random locations. Even though the distance between the two locations was so great that even tribulation stage powerhouses could not cross it by traveling through time and space, it was still the same. At this time, Luo Fan used this convenience to easily build a teleportation formation at the border between the void outside the many worlds in this territory. With a slight thought, a large number of tribulation stage powerhouses were already sent to the teleportation formation at the border. After they appeared, they spread out without the slightest hesitation and made way for latecomers to enter. As tribulation stage powerhouses, they were naturally extremely fast. In just a short moment, they had already spread out, allowing a large number of latecomers to gain a foothold. The number of teleportation formations that appeared at the border was extremely high. If one were to use numbers to describe it, it would probably need to be calculated in the millions. At this time, the millions of teleportation formations were operating at full speed. At every moment, tens of thousands of Tribulation Realm experts were passing through the formation and arriving at the border. If it weren't for the fact that the people being teleported were all Tribulation Realm experts with extremely fast reactions, they might have caused a great deal of chaos. In just a few dozen breaths, hundreds of millions of Tribulation Breaking Stage powerhouses had appeared at the edge. At this moment, Luo Fan's clones also appeared. Of course, not all of his clones were here, and not all of the Tribulation Realm experts were here either. At this moment, the number of Tribulation Breaking Stage powerhouses in this area was only equivalent to 1/10,000th of the total number of Tribulation Breaking Stage powerhouses in this area. Similarly, the incarnation of Luo Fan here was only 1 in a million, or even 1 in 10 million. The reason why not all the Tribulation Realm powerhouses were here, and all of Luo Fan's clones were here, was naturally because this was only a part of the entire border. Although this was a starting point, compared to the vast and boundless border, it was still only a small part that was not worth mentioning. It was possible to attack the territory of the will of heaven and earth here, but it was also very likely to cause some kind of backlash from the territory. This kind of backlash could appear at any location on the border, or even directly appear at any location without passing through the border. If all the power was gathered here, then the other locations would naturally become empty. Once this emptiness appeared, danger was approaching. Therefore, Luo Fan had only gathered a portion of the high-level power here. From a certain point of view, although there were a lot of high-level experts here, and they were all very powerful, their purpose was merely to probe the situation. At this moment, these Tribulation Realm powerhouses began to release the various powers they had mastered. These powers gathered towards Luo Fan's clone in front of them in an extremely subtle and mysterious way. Gradually, they turned into three-legged round cauldrons around them. After these three-legged round cauldrons appeared, Luo Fan and the others forcefully smashed them into the territory of the will of heaven and earth. Although these three-legged round cauldrons were condensed from power and power, they didn't seem illusory at all. Instead, they seemed extremely real and substantial. After they smashed into the territory, the effects were extremely obvious. In just an instant, a large area of the void in that territory was completely shattered. Even the characteristics and aura that originally belonged to Luo Fan's territory were continuously released in those territories, making those territories seem like they were gradually assimilating into Luo Fan's territory. As for the endless world that existed in the void, it was being stirred up crazily at this moment. It was unknown how many impacts were constantly surging towards those worlds, destroying them in a frenzy. This might seem terrifying, but it was actually the result of the three-legged round cauldron's original materials. In fact, at this moment, the countless three-legged round cauldrons still hadn't exerted their true strength. After being refined and sublimated by Luo Fan time and time again, the three-legged round cauldrons had almost become a metaphysical Tao. This kind of Tao had completely transcended its original characteristics. Even if it was just a shape, it was enough to obtain the kind of suppression effect that Luo Fan had condensed. At this moment, although these three-legged round cauldrons were condensed from the power of many Tribulation Realm powerhouses, since they were transformed into three-legged round cauldrons by Luo Fan, they naturally possessed a similar suppression effect. At this moment, the suppression effect clearly hadn't been fully activated. These three-legged round cauldrons naturally hadn't exerted their true strength yet. Just as the countless three-legged round cauldrons were brewing something, an invisible wave suddenly swept through the endless world in the territory of the world's will. In the end, the countless waves gathered above the world that was affected by the impact of the many three-legged round cauldrons. They surged out from the world and instantly began to stir up the surrounding void, stirring up the surrounding laws, stirring up everything. In the end, they vaguely formed something that shouldn't have appeared here, a faintly discernible wave vortex. After this vortex appeared, a power that surpassed everything instantly suppressed everything. The turbulence caused by the countless three-legged round cauldrons instantly calmed down. Whether it was the destroyed space-time or the terrifying suppression power that the three-legged round cauldrons were brewing, they were all completely wiped out at this moment. This is an artificial world's will. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was behind the many three-legged round cauldrons, was shocked. Although this vortex was formed by the convergence of waves, the aura it exuded, the feeling of transcendence, and even the extremely familiar structure of the vortex all corresponded to the world's will that was his greatest enemy. What did this situation mean? It clearly meant that this was an existence similar to the world's will. However, it was formed by the condensation of fluctuations, actually used this kind of method to bypass the restrictions, as expected of the world's will. After a while, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh emotionally. This existence that was similar to the world's will could naturally be traced back to the great world's will. From a certain perspective, it could be considered an incarnation of the world's will. It was merely an indirect incarnation of the world's will. Its connection with the world's will itself was far inferior to the connection between Luo Fan's incarnation and his main body. It could be said that the appearance of this artificial world will meant that the worlds will have finally thought of a way to bypass the restrictions of the karma of war and directly intervene in this decisive battle. This method was so ingenious that even Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh inwardly. It must be known that under the restrictions of the karma of war, whether it was Luo Fan, the world's will, or the incarnation of the world's will, apart from the various powers left behind in the world, it was impossible for them to directly participate in this battle. Under normal circumstances, even if the world's will was infinitely powerful and had supreme abilities, it would not be able to bypass the restrictions of the karma of war. However, at this moment, the worlds will actually borrow the existence of an unknown loophole to forcefully borrow the power of the world to create a brand new world's will. With the help of this new world's will, it directly participated in this battle. This brand new world's will was also the world's will. In essence, it was an existence of the same level as the original world's will. In terms of cultivation realm, it was roughly at the level of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Moreover, it was at the level of a seventh tribulation powerhouse that surpassed the peak and perfection stage. This level was already enough to deal with all the challenges in this simulated state of chaos, including the challenge of the power that countless Luo Fan gathered together to sublimate and sublimate. Moreover, because this man-made world was formed from the power of the various worlds in this territory, although it was extremely powerful in essence, its source was completely in line with the rules of the karma of war. Therefore, it would not be restricted by the karma of war at all, and could completely unleash its own power in this battle. Obviously, this was the backup plan of the world's will against the countless incarnations of Luo Fan. And this was clearly only one of the three parties. Among the three parties, apart from Luo Fan and the world's will, there is also the incarnation of the former world's will. The world's will would have corresponding methods, and the incarnation of the former world's will would obviously not be unresponsive. At this time, Luo Fan's territory was completely surrounded by countless worlds. That vast area belonged to the will of the heaven and earth. However, this did not mean that the incarnation of the former worlds will did not appear. Through the perception of the karma of war, Luo Fan clearly knew that behind the territory of the world's will, there was also the territory of the former world's will. According to its location and scale, the territory that belonged to the incarnation of the former worlds was also surrounded by the world's will's territory. Moreover, according to the aura, the territory that belonged to the incarnation of the former worlds will also had some kind of existence similar to the man-made world's will. Perhaps there would be a huge difference in performance, but there would not be much difference in essence. At the very least, they would be existences of the same level. However, if it was 1,000,000 years ago, I might not have a way. But now is not 1,000,000 years ago. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation secretly heaved a sigh of relief. At this moment, many of his incarnations looked relaxed, and there was an inexplicable excitement hidden in their eyes. Everything that was happening in front of him made him feel extremely comfortable. There was a powerful enemy, and he had the means to deal with it. This cannot be better. Immediately, the many three-legged cauldrons that had been sent into the territory of the worlds began to quickly gather. In the end, an incomparably huge three-legged cauldron appeared in the void. It was as if it could support the heavens and the earth. As soon as the huge three-legged cauldron appeared, an extremely shocking suppressive force was released, instantly suppressing everything around it, including the seemingly endless heavens and earth, the endless laws, and the rippling vortex. This suppressive force was so powerful and absolute that everything came to a standstill under its suppression. It was as if the world and the universe had completely fallen into the three-legged cauldron's control. Unfortunately, although the three-legged cauldron had grown so much, it was still insignificant compared to the territory of the world's will. At this moment, who knew how many worlds outside the range of the suppressive force began to frantically send all kinds of subtle and mysterious existences over through the connections between the worlds, directly into the fluctuating vortex. The fluctuating vortex began to slowly expand, gradually breaking the suppressive force around it, and slowly recovering its original vitality. The fluctuating vortex became more and more solid as the changes occurred, and the aura that belonged to the worlds that it emitted also became denser and more obvious. Chapter 29:50. When the vortex finally turned into the will of the world, the suppression power of the many three-legged cauldrons on the vortex finally lost its effect. All of the suppressive force was swept away by the vortex. In fact, the vortex even forcibly shattered the huge three-legged cauldron, turning it back into countless tiny three-legged cauldrons, just like when it had first appeared. Immediately after, an indescribable power directly bound the many tiny three-legged cauldrons that had disintegrated and slowly pushed them back towards the source of the cauldrons. In other words, they were quickly pushed towards the direction of the many Luo fan clones. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's clones did not continue to resist. These three-legged round cauldrons were merely products formed from the power of billions of experts who had entered the heavenly tribulation. They were nothing compared to the three-legged round cauldrons formed from the power related to the true divine that his doppelganger possessed. Even the three-legged cauldrons that he had condensed over the past million years were far inferior to the three-legged cauldrons that he had constantly conquered. If it was the three-legged cauldrons that his clone controlled, he would naturally be able to completely suppress the will of the world that had just taken shape. However, it was very clear that the three-legged cauldron in the clone's grasp had been treated by the karma of war as his clone's power. It had been completely isolated from him since 1,000,000 years ago, and it was impossible for it to participate in this war. Therefore, it was obviously extravagant to hope that his clone's three-legged cauldrons could suppress the will of the world. Since he could not make the three-legged cauldrons that he had absolute confidence in suppressing the will of the world, then what he could still look forward to was obviously the three-legged cauldrons that he had condensed over the past 1,000,000 years of conquering the world. After no longer resisting, the many three-legged cauldrons were directly pressed back into Luo Fan's territory, and once again disintegrated into endless power, returning to the many tribulation stage powerhouses. After that, without waiting for the man-made will of the world to do anything else, Luo Fan's clone took action again. Without any movement, a huge three-legged cauldron crossed the air and smashed into the territory of the will of the world. This huge three-legged cauldron towered between the heavens and the earth. Compared to the huge three-legged cauldron that had been formed by the other three-legged cauldrons, it was even more powerful. A perfect characteristic was constantly being emitted from the huge three-legged cauldron. Just this aura alone had already shattered the surrounding restraining and repelling forces. Accompanied by this incomparably astonishing aura, the gigantic three-legged cauldron had already traversed countless light years in the blink of an eye, directly arriving above the man-made world's will and fiercely suppressing it. After over 1,000,000 years of refinement and improvement, the three-legged cauldron had reached the limit of the primal chaos state. At this moment, it was like a perfect world, and it contained the profundities of all the founders of the world. At this moment, although the suppressive power it released could not be compared to the three-legged cauldron formed by the power related to the true divine, it was still far stronger than the body formed by the many three-legged cauldrons. Moreover, it was not just 1 or 2 times stronger, but tens of thousands of times stronger. In just an instant, everything seemed to have been completely frozen. Even time seemed so fragile under the suppressive power of the three-legged cauldron, like an ordinary piece of paper being pressed down. At this moment, an indescribable amount of energy continuously gathered from the endless world outside into the suppressed region. It was continuously released through the world and gathered towards the man-made world's will, causing the man-made world's to seem to be constantly absorbing some kind of nourishment. It obtained stronger and stronger resistance, forcing the three-legged cauldron to constantly increase the suppressive power it released. Only by doing this could it be confident in continuing to suppress the man-made world's will, and only then would it have hope of completely conquering the man-made world's will. Suddenly, a crack appeared on the man-made world's will. Immediately after, indescribable sharp rays of light shot out from the crack and fiercely charged towards the three-legged cauldron. They seemed to want to directly attack the three-legged cauldron in order to completely annihilate the suppressive power. However, it was clear that the sharp rays of light were terrifying attacks condensed by the world's will. Normally speaking, if they were shot into a world, they would be able to completely wipe out everything in that world and even the main body of that world. However, facing the suppressive power released by the three-legged cauldron, the sharp rays of light were clearly not enough. Although it was able to rush out of the crack, it was only able to rush out for a short distance before it turned into a statue and was forcibly frozen in the void. It was as if it was a strange thorn growing out of the crack. At this moment, the crack did not stop at all. No matter how many sharp rays of light were frozen, it did not have the slightest intention of giving up. Instead, it continued to release sharp rays of light. These rays of light constantly rushed out of the crack and were constantly solidified. It looked as if there were strange thorns growing out of the crack. This strange scene was extremely horrifying. At this moment, the number of unknown existences that had gathered in the endless world outside had already reached a certain limit. Even the nature of the world that was enveloped by the suppressive power had changed. Vaguely, it seemed like the world was gradually becoming transparent, as if its essence was gradually turning into some kind of light. This scene gave people the feeling that the suppressive power was the source of the power that was maintaining the original state of the world. On the contrary, if the suppressive power that was originally suppressing the world disappeared, the world would lose its original state and collapse completely, turning into all kinds of indescribable light. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan did not relax at all. He controlled the three-legged cauldron and continued to release the suppressive power. He wanted to completely conquer the world and the man-made worlds below. Although it seemed like the world could only maintain its original state with the help of the suppressive power, it seemed like the world would completely collapse once it lost the restraints of the suppressive power. However, Luo Fan did not have any intention of letting go of the suppressive power. Perhaps if he let go of the suppressive power, the world would indeed collapse and turn into endless light. But what about it? What would those rays of light do after the heaven and earth disappeared? Would the light be of help to the man-made world's will? Would it allow the man-made world's will to completely break free from the suppressive power of the three-legged cauldron? All these possibilities were a question mark to him. Under such circumstances, how could he let go of the suppressive power? With a thought, more and more Tribulation Realm powerhouses appeared at the border through the teleportation formation. Under his command, the numerous Tribulation Realm powerhouses gradually began to enter the territory that belonged to the world's will. Currently, both sides had fallen into a stalemate in terms of overall strength. In that case, the real deciding factor would naturally be the power at the bottom. That's right, for Luo Fan, existences like Tribulation Realm powerhouses were already at the bottom. Fortunately, the three-legged cauldron was not the three-legged cauldron formed by the power related to the true saint. If it was the three-legged cauldron, even Luo Fan would not be able to have absolute control over it. In that case, everything within its range of suppression would be completely suppressed by it. If that was the case, any living being or cultivator that stepped into it would be completely suppressed. This included the Tribulation Realm powerhouses who were on Luo Fan's side. In other words, if the three-legged cauldron that suppressed the man-made worlds was formed by the power related to the true saint, then the Tribulation Realm powerhouses entering the territory of the worlds would be equivalent to adding a large number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses to the territory of the world's will. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron that Luo Fan's incarnations had spent more than 1,000,000 years to condense was completely different. Compared to the three-legged cauldron formed by the power related to the true saint, the overall power of the three-legged cauldron was slightly weaker. However, there was an advantage, and that was that Luo Fan could completely control the three-legged cauldron. The effect of this complete control was that wherever he wanted to suppress, he could completely suppress it. If he did not want to suppress it, even if it was within the range of the suppression, it would not be affected at all. At this moment, when many Tribulation Realm powerhouses entered the territory of the world's will and entered the large area suppressed by the three-legged cauldron, everything around them was suppressed, but these Tribulation Realm powerhouses acted as if nothing had happened. They were relaxed and did not show any signs of being suppressed. Very soon, many Tribulation Realm powerhouses arrived in front of the worlds that seemed to have turned into rays of light. They began to split into teams and entered those worlds one by one. Although the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses was insignificant compared to the overall number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses in Luo Fan's territory, and could only be regarded as a minority among the minority. However, the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses had to be counted in the hundreds of millions. At this moment, although the number of worlds in the territory suppressed by Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron was quite large, it was only counted in the hundreds of billions. Obviously, the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses far exceeded the number of worlds in those worlds. In fact, it was not tens or hundreds of times more, but thousands or even tens of thousands of times more. Under such circumstances, even if it was evenly distributed, the worlds that were currently being suppressed in the territory of the worlds could still have thousands of Tribulation Realm powerhouses. Thousands of Tribulation Realm powerhouses, and every single one of them was not ordinary. There were existences that had just become Tribulation Realm powerhouses. There were at least second or third Tribulation Realm powerhouses, and the stronger ones were even fourth or fourth Tribulation Realm powerhouses. It was easy to imagine how much of a threat this was to those worlds. These Tribulation Realm powerhouses surged into those worlds one by one, and each and every one of them shook those worlds, causing the stability that the worlds were already barely maintaining to collapse in an instant. Although the three-legged cauldron suppression power was strong, the resistance of the world's will in the territory was also unquestionable. It was naturally impossible for a world to break free from that suppressive force. But now, the entire territory of the world's will was supporting those worlds. It was doing its best to pour all kinds of indescribable existences into those worlds through the connection between the worlds. It was constantly helping those worlds, and the effect was obviously completely different. On the whole, those worlds were still unable to break free from the suppression power, and even the Tribulation Realm powerhouses were unable to charge out of their own worlds and truly participate in the battle against Luo Fan's side. However, the suppression power within those worlds could no longer restrain those worlds. Although those worlds seemed to still be suppressed on the outside, they were extremely active on the inside. All the living beings, cultivators, and experts were doing everything they could to break free from the suppression and shackles outside. Under such circumstances, a large number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses belonging to Luo Fan's side charged into those worlds. There was no need to say what the outcome would be. In just an instant, an intense battle broke out between the heavens and earth. From the outside, it looked like the heavens and earth that had turned into light was gradually returning to their original appearance. The astonishing resistance that had been attacking the suppressive force outside was also constantly shrinking and weakening in the process. Following this change, the crack on the man-made worlds began to gradually close up. Although the sharp light did not disappear, it gradually stopped appearing as the crack closed up. Evidently, because those worlds were affected, the man-made worlds had lost its source of strength, and it became more and more powerless in the face of the three-legged cauldron suppression. This process continued on and on. Only after 10 days and 10 nights did there appear any new changes. This new change was not because the man-made worlds had changed again to strengthen its resistance, but because it had begun another round of challenge against the three-legged cauldron. Chapter 2951. The situation of the worlds invaded by the Tribulation Realm powerhouses rapidly deteriorated. Even after withdrawing the power that supported the man-made world's will, the worlds were still extremely powerless against the Tribulation Realm powerhouses. In the internal battles between the worlds, the forces that belonged to the world did not do nothing against the Tribulation Realm powerhouses. Their resistance did indeed cause a portion of the Tribulation Realm powerhouses to suffer. Some of the invading Tribulation Realm powerhouses that belonged to Luo Fan's side were completely wiped out, causing the Tribulation Realm powerhouses on Luo Fan's side to suffer huge losses. However, this could not reverse the rapid conquest of those worlds. After an unknown period of time, there was finally a world that was completely conquered by the Tribulation Realm powerhouses on Luo Fan's side. As that world was conquered, the various subtle existences that were constantly injected into it from the outside were instantly cut off. The reason why these worlds were injected with all kinds of subtle existences was because these worlds were connected to the auras of the other worlds in the territory of the will of the world, and their essence was the same. Now, this effect of connecting auras, this characteristic of the same essence, had obviously been lost due to the conquest of these worlds. In this way, these worlds naturally no longer had any connection with the other worlds in the vast territory. Without any connection, how could they still absorb benefits from those worlds? As the first world was conquered, it was as if a switch had been opened, and the speed at which the worlds were conquered was as fast as an avalanche. Almost every breath, thousands of worlds were completely conquered. In just a few days, all the invaded worlds had been completely conquered by the Tribulation Realm powerhouses that belonged to Luo Fan's side. When the last world was completely conquered, the incomparably mysterious and vast man-made worlds will completely withered, as if its bones had been pulled out. Under the effect of the suppressive force, it completely collapsed. If it were not for the suppressive force suppressing it, it would not even have been able to maintain the form of a vortex. Instead, it would have completely collapsed and dissipated, turning into endless fragments. At this moment, many of Luo Fan's clones frowned at the same time. This was because he suddenly realized that there were layers upon layers of indescribable barriers that seemed to be erected between the heavens and the earth. They surrounded Luo Fan's territory from all directions, as well as the area that he had just conquered. These barriers were extremely profound. They were like primal chaos, emitting a chaotic, supreme, and all-encompassing miraculous aura. Although it was a barrier, at a glance, it seemed boundless, as if countless worlds could be stuffed into it. Are you trying to seal me? What's the point of this? Luo Fan was secretly surprised at this time. As the man-made world was completely suppressed, and all the heavens and earths in that area were conquered. That area became Luo Fan's new territory. At the same time, the hole in the sky where the will of the universe resided also expanded a little. Obviously, under the effect of war karma, the outcome of the war was completely linked to the size of the hole. Now that he had just conquered it, although these heavens and earths already belonged to Luo Fan, the various rules, laws, and principles still needed to be further adjusted before they could become his power. Therefore, at this time, Luo Fan did not begin to force these heavens and earths to release their power. He only left some tribulation initiation powerhouses in these heavens and earths to adjust the heavens and earths. His many clones brought many tribulation initiation powerhouses who had shrunk to a small portion to the corresponding barrier of this new territory. Facing that barrier, even Luo Fan felt as if he was facing a state of chaos. He felt that the time, space, matter, energy, rules, laws, great Tao, and so on in the area in front of him, as well as everything else, seemed to be mixed together in a very strange way. Occasionally, he would even be able to see the countless strange worlds and wonderful worlds that existed within the barrier, with a slight thought. The three-legged cauldron that suppressed the man-made heavens and earths had already arrived in front of the barrier in a flash. Now, the three-legged cauldron had become a little stronger than before. Obviously, completely suppressing the man-made heavens and earths was also quite beneficial for the three-legged cauldron. After the three-legged cauldron appeared, it trembled slightly and released an incredible suppressive force. It fiercely stabbed towards the barrier that seemed to be in a state of chaos. Luo Fan could even make the suppressive force bypass the individual bodies of some cultivators within its range of effect. It was self-evident how precise his control of the suppressive force was. At this time, it could not be simpler to mold the suppressive force into a weapon-like effect. The suppressive force was like a sharp blade that stabbed straight into the barrier in front of it. It was instantly devoured by the barrier and disappeared without a trace, as if it had entered a state of true chaos. Even the three-legged cauldron could not retrieve it. Although it can't compare to the simulated state of chaos, it does have some of the charm of the simulated state of chaos. In an instant, Luo Fan had a general understanding of the nature of the barrier. The barrier in front of him was naturally far inferior to the simulated state of chaos that was created by the seventh great calamity, which could accommodate countless world creators and endless worlds. It could even give birth to an incredible heavens and earth's will. However, although it could not compare to the simulated state of chaos, it still had some of the mysterious charm of the simulated state of chaos. This mysterious charm made this barrier almost a hopeless situation for those who were not world creators. Even if it was a tribulation stage powerhouse, before the world was created and before the world was protected, they would definitely be completely blocked by the barrier. Even their perception of time would be distorted. In that case, no matter how many Tribulation Realm powerhouses Luo Fan sent into the barrier, they would only be able to float in the barrier as if they were sealed. It would be impossible for them to pass through the barrier, and it would be even more impossible for them to have any effect on the wider area behind the barrier. The barrier surrounded Luo Fan's territory from all directions. There were no loopholes at all, be it up, down, left, or right. From a macroscopic point of view, there was a huge spherical barrier around Luo Fan's territory at this time, completely sealing him inside. Outside the barrier, there was an incomparably huge vortex that slowly rotated around the barrier. Every tiny line on the vortex seemed to contain the endless laws of the universe, mysterious and profound. The process of its rotation seemed to compress the endless principles of heaven and earth into it, releasing them endlessly. It was so mysterious. It could be said that the rotation of the vortex alone was enough for an ordinary person to cultivate from zero to the level of a tribulation stage powerhouse. Of course, it was enough, but it was not necessary. If a living being did not have enough opportunities, comprehension, or speed of breaking the shackles of lifespan, they would still die in the end. And such living beings probably accounted for more than 99% of all the living beings watching the vortex. This vortex had the same aura as the man-made will of the universe that had been completely suppressed by the three-legged cauldron. It was obvious that it was the man-made will of the universe. However, compared to the man-made will that had been completely suppressed before, the scale of this man-made will was tens of thousands of times larger. Faintly, there was already a hint of the true will of the world of this great world. At this moment, an inexplicable voice rang out from the hole in the space-time where the will of the universe resided. What's the point of doing this? Are you trying to stall for time? As the voice rang out, the figure of the middle-aged man, who was the embodiment of the former will of the universe, appeared. At this moment, if one looked down from high up in the sky, one would be able to see an incomparably massive vortex that practically enveloped the entire heavens and earth. Beneath the vortex, there were two dusky, spherical barriers. There was a huge difference in the size of the two barriers. One of them was hundreds of thousands of times larger than the other. It was obvious that the two barriers covered the territory of Luo Fan and the embodiment of the former will of the universe. Among them, the largest one belonged to Luo Fan. The smaller one belonged to the embodiment of the former will of the universe. Stalling for time? Do you think this is stalling for time? At this moment, the voice that belonged to the will of the universe came from the hole. Isn't that so? The barrier clearly separates the inside from the outside. This way, neither side can hurt the other. If this isn't stalling for time, what is it? The middle-aged man sighed with a look of pity in his eyes. It was as if he was saying that Yi Qingyu had fallen. Why are you pretending to be ignorant? Can't you tell what I'm trying to do? After all, you're my predecessor." The voice came from the hole. These words had triggered an inexplicable reaction from Luo Fan, who was not present at the scene. At the core of the world, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. His vision instantly crossed the endless obstacles and directly saw the hole in the space-time where the will of the universe resided. If it was an ordinary living being, they naturally wouldn't be able to sense the spread of this perception. However, for existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others, the arrival of this perception was like coming in person. At this moment, the will of the universe and the embodiment of the former will of the universe looked at Luo Fan's perception at the same time. It was as if they could directly see Luo Fan's figure. Luo Fan's perception condensed slightly and directly condensed an embodiment of his perception. "You guys can continue. I seem to have heard that you're planning to reveal the hidden secret. You don't mind if I listen in, right?" Luo Fan said with a smile. "Actually, I mind very much." The embodiment of the former will of the universe sighed. "I don't mind. Actually, this isn't something shameful to me," the will of the universe said indifferently. It seemed like the secret that it had just revealed was just the simple fact that it had already eaten today. Your predecessor was his embodiment, and his predecessor was you. It seemed that I guessed correctly back then. The relationship between the two of you is indeed not as simple as the relationship between the embodiment and the original body. Luo Fan smiled faintly at this moment. His interested look made the embodiment of the former will of the universe frown. "This matter has nothing to do with you, nor does it have anything to do with our current situation. Let's end this topic here." The embodiment of the former will of the universe sighed and said, "Don't. Why do we have to end it here? Although this simulated chaotic state seems to have an endless world and endless living beings, in fact, only the three of us can barely be considered the same. Strictly speaking, only the three of us are real. The relationship between the three of you represents 2/3 of this simulated chaotic state. How can you say that it has nothing to do with you?" Luo Fan only chuckled at this moment. When he said that only the three of them could be considered the same in this simulated chaotic state, he wasn't speaking carelessly. This was what he really thought. After all, apart from the three of them, all other living beings and all the world couldn't see the true nature of this simulated chaotic state and couldn't really determine the outcome of this simulated chaotic state. Apart from the three of them, in their eyes, everything else was muddle-headed and could only go with the flow. Even Luo Fan didn't have much interest in communicating with such existences, let alone the will of the universe and the embodiment of the former will of the universe. Under such circumstances, in the eyes of the three of them, the only ones who could communicate with each other in this simulated chaotic state were obviously each other. Of course, saying that other living beings and other worlds were all illusions was naturally a little too strict. Naturally, Luo Fan didn't really think so in his heart, although there were some signs of it. However, this didn't stop him from saying it at this moment. The embodiment of the former will of the universe and the former will of the universe fell silent. After a long while, the embodiment of the former will of the universe said, "You guessed it right. The relationship between us is indeed more complicated than it seems on the surface. In fact, I was the first will of the universe to appear in front of you previously. He's just a new will that was born after I broke away from it." When Luo Fan heard this, even though he had expected it, he couldn't help but feel inexplicably shocked.